Let's get going. This is the October 30th, 2018 Town of Nantucket Zoning Board of Appeals meeting. Can I get, is there any printed agenda that I don't have, per se? No? Okay, so we don't have to approve the agenda. The minutes, I noticed a slight error. I think they were amended, correct?
Correct.
So what we're voting on is the amended minutes. If anybody wants to make a motion to approve the minutes as amended, that'd be great.
I'll make a motion.
Susan makes the motion.
Second.
Karen seconds. Any further discussion? No. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Okay.
Somebody leave this down here?
I'm sure somebody, this is not mine, somebody's notes about the land council.
Mr. Amber.
Okay, so tonight, in the interest of getting through and hearing from the consultants who were not heard last meeting and came and had to leave without being heard, we're gonna let the consultants go ahead, speak, and the board is gonna ask any questions they might have, and we're gonna refrain from public comment until after all of the consultants have spoken, and then we'll get into it. So, in the interest of moving forward, why don't we start with the, I guess the water quality consultant.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, members of the ZBA. My name is Peter Newton. I'm sorry. Sometimes these things are so loud. My name is Peter Newton. I'm with Bristol Engineering Advisors. I've been a practicing hydrogeologist for about 25 years, focusing primarily on drinking water, water supply, groundwater, fate, and transport. New England is not unique, but we are typified, particularly southern New England, by an extensive glacial history with sand and gravel outwash deposits. There have been multiple glaciations in New England over the years. The most recent one, the Wisconsin end, is the one that has created the topography and the landscape that we see today. About 20,000 years ago, the glaciers, several lobes, Cape Cod lobe, each of these is different lobes, came down, extended as far as Nantucket, and then over time, that was about the southernmost extent, and then they began to retreat 16 to 15,000 years ago, all the way back to Cape Cod about 12,000, 14,000 years ago, and then retreated all the way back up to the Arctic. At the time that these glaciers were extended, even as far here, the water table was, the sea level was down between 300 and 400 feet from where it is today. So you were not an island when these glaciers were still in place and retreating. As they retreated, the meltwater raised the sea level back up and isolated Nantucket from the mainland, as well as Martha's Vineyard, Elizabeth Islands, and others. On Nantucket, you have what's fairly typical. It's typical of Cape Cod as well. You have a moraine deposit, which is basically the terminal extent of the glacier. Those deposits tend to be sorted. They're basically bulldozed into place, and then as the glacier melts and retreats, we have what are called outwash planes. So the southern half of the island is glacial outwash, which is as that meltwater retreats, it carries with it sands, gravels, sediments, silts, and sorts them based on the velocity of the water. The closer to the ice margin, the faster the water's flowing. Typically, the coarser the deposits, and they fine out as you head further, in this case, south. So this is that's the most recent one. Those deposits are about 100 to 110 feet deep. Over here, these Wisconsin glacial deposits are only about this deep on this cross section, this boring. The USGS did a boring down to 1,660 feet in the center of the island a number of years ago, and found sediments all the way down to about 1,460 feet. Those sediments are multiple glaciations, and then glaciations down to about 450, 500 feet. And then below that, you have sediments that go back to the dinosaurs, just about to the dinosaurs, about 200 million, 225 million years old on top of rock. So you go back to the mainland, you go to places like Newport or Rockport. That bedrock is under your feet, but it's about 1,500 feet. It's about a quarter of a mile below you. These sediments are interesting from a geologic perspective, but they don't have any bearing on the water resources in Nantucket. These upper aquifers, however, do. We have at least 3 separate, distinct aquifers, 2 of which are relevant to you. The upper one, the Wisconsin, which I said is about 100 feet deep, is what we call an unconfined or water table aquifer. That's when you go, if you drill down or you see a stream emerging from a hillside, that's water table aquifer. That's water that precipitation lands on the ground and just flows through the ground and migrates to streams or ultimately migrates out to the ocean. Below that is a layer of fine materials, silts, that's also mixed with shells. This marks the boundary between the upper Wisconsin glaciation and the lower Illinoisan glaciation. So there's been multiple advances and retreats of the glaciers over the last several 100,000 years. This Illinoisan aquifer is particularly relevant to Nantucket. This line here, which I'll get into a little bit more, is the inferred transition zone between fresh water, comes from the sky, and salt water that comes from the oceans. So this, because the deposits on Nantucket are so permeable, the water doesn't mound up like it does in some places. The water tends to go down and it migrates to where it can't, basically migrates down to that clay layer or that silty lake layer and then builds up. But because the materials are so porous, the water spreads out. So we don't end up with, we don't have a lot of water table relief on Nantucket. We have a high of 10 to 12 feet above sea level here. This is about 6 to 8 feet here, 2 feet, and then it actually is fresh water extending out a little bit to the south. As the water mounds flows from here, it pushes the saltwater interface out a little bit into a little bit offshore. This is important for a couple of reasons. One is because we don't have a lot of water table relief. We don't have a lot of hydraulic gradient pushing the water from the higher levels to the lower levels. The gradients are, well, you could do the math. It's a couple of feet per mile. The other reason that it's important that what the water table elevations are is that there's a relationship between freshwater and saltwater. Saltwater is about 2.5% heavier than freshwater. So when the rain, so that's a factor of 40 roughly. So when rainfall lands on the surface and infiltrates to the ground, it depresses the salt water, it pushes that salt water down by a ratio of 40 to 1. So for every foot of water, of fresh water above sea level, above the average sea level, you push the salt water down 40 feet. Now because we have 10 to 12 feet of freshwater elevation above sea level, the center of the island, that depresses the salt water down about 500 feet. So saltwater, there is salt water beneath us, but it's fairly deep, particularly where the Wannacommets water company's wells are. Now, Wanacana Water Company has five, they're, as you all know, the primary water supplier for most of the island. They have 5 public water supply wells, 3 at the Milestone site, the North Pasture, and the State Forest wells. What we have here is delineations of a capture zone for the shallow wells and the deep wells. Now, let me go back. The 2 of the Milestone wells, 15 and 16, are screened, they draw water from the upper Wisconsin aquifer, okay? They combined produce, I'm gonna double check my numbers right. Oh, wrong paper. About 1,400 gallons per minute. So that's just under 2,000 gallons, 2 million gallons per day. The milestone number 2, the North Pasture and the State Forest wells are all screened below that the semi-confining unit, that low permeability layer, into the Illinoisan aquifer. And they combined are capable of yielding about 2,100 gallons per minute, or just about 3 million gallons a day. So combined, Wanacana has the capacity of pumping just about 6 million gallons per day, about 4,100 gallons per minute, or just over 6 million gallons per day. One of the big questions we have here is, that I was asked to investigate is this project likely, or does it have the potential to adversely impact the Wanacana water supply, or the town's water supply? The short answer is, in my professional opinion, it's very unlikely. There are a couple of reasons for that. One, the project site is located in this area, right about there. This blue delineation is a delineation we call the Zone 2 or capture zone delineation for the 2 upper Milestone wells in the Wisconsin, the upper aquifer, the one that the Surfside project sits right on top of. That delineation doesn't actually even extend to the project site. This is not your wellhead protection district. This is just a delineation of the capture zone based on pump testing and numerical modeling that was done by Wanacana's consultants. And I've reviewed the model, and it looks appropriate. So that says to me that, so the Zone 2, again, not to be confused with the Wellhead Protection District, but the Mass DEP, Mass Department of Environmental Protection, has a fairly clear definition of what a Zone 2 is. And that's the maximum pumping rate for 180 days under the most extreme conditions that are reasonably expected, which is 180 days, 6 months, without any rainfall. Some of us in the business sort of chuckle at that, said it has never gone 6 months without raining in New England. We've had periods of dry weather and below average precipitation and droughts. They're 20 to 40 years apart, but they do happen, but it's never gone 6 months. So we look at it as a very conservative delineation. Okay, so what that says is basically this line reflects where the water table would respond, the limits of where the water table would respond to pumping. That doesn't mean a particle of water dropped here takes 180 days to get there. What that means is what we call the cone of depression. So as the well pumps, it draws the water down near the well, and that propagates out. That extends out laterally until it reaches either a recharge boundary where the water coming in equals the amount of water that's coming out. Or we hit some sort of other feature. In theory, it'll extend out indefinitely. But after 180 days, this is where that signal of pumping extends to for the upper wells, for the Milestone 15 and 16, the new wells. So that's not so the project site is not actually in the zone 2 for those 2 wells, which in my opinion, because they're in the shallower aquifer, or would be more likely to be the ones susceptible. The red line is the combined zone 2, so using a combined analysis for the milestone wells, the shallower wells, and the ones that are set in the Illinoisan aquifer, the one that's deeper. Those wells are set 175 feet below ground with a layer of silt and shells between the Wisconsin and the Illinoisan. All that water those draw from comes from above, but it takes time to get there. And there's 180, 160, 170 feet of filtration between the surface and those wells. We know that water quality is different. We know those wells draw different because the water quality is significantly different. The pH, the measure of acidity or alkalinity of the water, is much higher below in the Illinoisan aquifer than it is in the upper one. Typically, rainfall and superficial aquifers, water table aquifers, have a pH of between 5 and 6.5. They tend to be a little bit on the acidic side. The lower wells have a pH of around 8, a little higher than 8. And we think, my guess, my assumption is that's water that's percolating through that layer of shells with the calcium, and it's a buffer, and it raises the pH. So, so in my professional opinion, this is a very conservative delineation. The Surfside project is within it, but there's a lot of with this. What? Oh well, I'm not. I'm only doing it occasionally.
Can you just highlight where the project is?
That's right here.
Right in there. Okay, thank you.
Right. Is it? I'm sorry. I pointed that out a little while ago. Maybe people didn't see it. But so the Surfside project's here. The milestone wells are here. North Pastures over here, and the state forest well is right here.
Now you gotta slow it down a little bit when
Sorry.
when you're moving the cursor around.
All right.
Fairgrounds Roads, isn't it
Yeah, I think
further
the
up?
project is more over that way.
The project's here.
No,
Yeah, over,
right there,
Right
right
there.
around there.
Right there.
around, yeah.
Okay, sorry. I forgot my glasses. I can't try to think that's all right. So that's the project. The state forest well field, the milestone well field is up in this area, and then I believe the North Pasture is up here.
And just to be clear, the Illinoisan is on top of the Wisconsin.
No.
No, the Wisconsin is the top. The Wisconsin glaciation is the one that we all know. It's the one that's created, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, Cape Cod, and is responsible for basically most of the drinking water in eastern Massachusetts. You guys, which no one else has, have a lower aquifer, the Illinoisan, from a glaciation that was about 150 to 200,000 years earlier. So you have a separate aquifer that really no one else has. So it's another thing that makes Nantucket unique. And so the blue delineation is the Wisconsin and the upper aquifer zone of contribution. The red is a combined upper and lower. Okay. The other thing that if we go back to the water table map, that I alluded to the fact that we have very little hydraulic gradient, very little difference in groundwater elevation between the well sites and the project site. We look at something called groundwater seepage velocity, and what that basically is what's the speed of a particle of water as it's flowing through the ground under normal conditions. Because the gradient is so flat, even though we have fairly permeable soils in both the upper and the lower, the formula is velocity equals the hydraulic conductivity times the hydraulic gradient divided by how porous the soil is. Basically, we end up with seepage velocities of about 1/3 of a foot per day throughout most of this area. So given the distances of about a mile between the project site and the milestone wells, that's about a 45 to 50 year travel time. That's a lot, and even if, and that's assuming that the water actually gets there, which according, it may over that 50-year period of time, but the Zone 2 delineation, which under Massachusetts guidelines, doesn't extend that far. It doesn't reflect. It basically says, if you're more than, it doesn't say this, but in effect, it says if you're more than 25 years out, we're not really that worried about it. We wouldn't consider that. From the state's perspective, necessitating protection. The communities are free to do, be as protective as they choose. The Wellhead Protection District, which the town has implemented, is largely based on this larger, and that appropriately so. Once water is contaminated, it doesn't come back. It's hard to clean it up. It's very expensive. So, but given the nature of the project is primarily residential, and its distance from the island's primary sources of drinking water, the greater island's primary source of drinking water, as I understand, or I've come to understand, that there are a few private wells in the area, which are maybe another matter, but that I don't think, it's my opinion that this project doesn't necessarily represent an undue threat to the Wannacomet water supply. That's essentially my conclusion. These are sort of the words that follow that. I didn't get into, so I know there was a question that was raised about the water company's ability to provide the water. I've read some opinions that were presented to Mark Willett that have been made available. And I kind of leave that to them. They dove into it in a lot more detail. But there's a difference between the capacity of water available, which is around the 6 million gallons per day, and what the state allows you to withdraw on average. So on average, currently the Wannacomet Water Company is allotted at 1.68 million gallons per day. In recent communications with the water company, DEP, the state, is indicated that they are willing to extend that number a little bit. Now it's complicated and can be a time-consuming process to negotiate or navigate getting a greater authorization from DEP, but there's nothing that says that it looks like DEP is willing to do it. So the water company has sufficient infrastructure and capacity to meet the additional demand, so I don't think I don't think we have a supply problem there. Again, but that's really, I don't want to speak for Mark. That's really Mark's issue. And then we have the protection of the deep aquifer that's semi-confining, or that low permeability layer with the shells, to where the bulk of about 60% of the water supply is withdrawn. That's fairly well protected. And the upper aquifer, again, the site's not actually within the delineated capture zone, and I estimate between a 45 and 50 year travel time, which is pretty conservative in a lot of most circles. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that people that the project can do. I think I haven't seen the latest iteration of the plans, but I was a little surprised when I saw the first set that the stormwater was being managed fairly old school. That low impact development, which is a buzzword that everybody hears, is probably familiar with. Almost all projects today, particularly large scale projects, are being done with some components, if not entirely, under a low impact development, which is treating water on site with grass swales, with rain gardens, trying to reuse it if possible. I've worked on a project on the Cape where they have a large cistern to capture stormwater and use it for irrigation. I mean, I think those things should be implemented, should be considered for implementation. And I'd also suggest, I assume, I don't know, I'm not privy to this stuff, but I would suggest that a homeowners association be established to manage the snow removal, landscaping, and that those that HOA documents require that anyone who is performing maintenance services be familiar and certified that they're familiar with integrated pest management and our pesticide applicators, and not just herbicides and pesticides can be a threat to water supply, and it's prudent in any event. And road salt de-icing practices are also a very common contaminant of large projects. And that's very difficult to treat. So that's really my presentation.
Thank you. Does anybody have a questions from the board at this point? I have a couple.
Great.
So you talked about the original plan, which is the plan you looked at,
Yep.
Being relatively old school. It seemed that way to me too. I mean, I'm not an expert, but George, did you want to say something?
I did. I just wanted to mention if the consultant could address the zoning bylaw provisions at issue within the purview of his review, I think that would be very helpful for the issues that you're considering when you're determining whether to deny waivers or approve them with conditions. So there was an analysis done.
There is, yeah.
With regard to a couple of bylaw provisions. I think it would be helpful to the board if we could hear a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, I'll ask my question first, and then George, you're specifically talking about Chapter 139, Section 12B, 1B, and 1Q? Okay. Who's in the report? I had a question about the old school, new school type of filtration system or recharge system. Can even with the original plan, which was more dense than what we're looking at now, could you take care of all of the rainwater or the recharge in the more innovative way with rain gardens, swales, et cetera, instead of storm receptors and whatnot?
You can. Where you run into difficulty is with the density. You end up. You need land area for anything but this. You need to have. Sorry. You need land area. Okay. Grass swales, vegetated swales are very common, and they can capture, and they're basically upgrades of an old drainage ditch, but they're maintained and they are engineered in a way so that most 60 or 70% of the storms can that are not the 50-year storm or 100-year storm. It manages that water. It slows the velocity of the water down in a grassy area so that the sediment drops out, and that sediment gets retained in the grass, and then basically the grass and the microbes that live in the soil can digest and incorporate pollutants. They don't incorporate salt, so salt is an issue. Salt passes through. But you generally can. But you still need some mechanism to then, in a heavy storm, to deal with the stormwater. Most of these low-impact development projects do have provisions for they're either underneath the swale they will put infiltration galleries with an above ground, a raised up, honeycomb or something to allow the water to infiltrate. It takes a little more maintenance because those things get plugged with leaves. If leaves get down below, then they can plug up the ground surface, and then your subsurface drainage is not effective. It would take more engineering for sure. These things can be under roads. The stormwater infiltration can be under roads, but you do want to make sure that you're catching the first flush and treating it. And I think the site, the original density would be challenging, but doable.
Okay, the new plan that we're considering is smaller, so.
Right.
Will you address the point that George brought up?
Yeah, so I sort of did. 12B 1B, which is industrial incidental use of fertilizers, would be in establishing an HOA or requiring in the HOA documents that pesticide applicators be licensed and trained and document that they've been trained in the application of pesticides in sensitive areas. That's not unusual. That's a fairly common requirement in situations like this. The other one is the stormwater, and I kind of referred to that. It's I'm basically referring to the fact that if they want a waiver, they ought to show a little more treatment. And I would, I think LID development techniques are a very effective way of meeting some of these requirements.
Do the new methods require more or less maintenance than the old school, or the same?
It's different maintenance. If you have an old catch basin, you go in with a clamshell bucket, and you just clean the leaves out or the sediment out every 6 months, or as the case is, probably every few years. If they're grass swales, they require mowing, but they can be designed so that you can drive a tractor mower right through them and maintain them. And those grass clippings should be picked up, otherwise they can mat the surface and block the infiltration capacity. But it's a different kind of maintenance, but it's not outside the realm of what an ordinary landscape contractor should be comfortable doing.
Including if you had that secondary system underneath the swale that has to have some inlet, you would just make sure that was cleaned on a regular
If the
basis.
primary is not maintained, the secondary will be a problem. So they have to maintain the primary, swales, and because they're hard to access. It would require digging up, if they plug up and you only know when you get a storm and nothing's draining. But they've been used successfully in lots of places in New England with, maybe less favorable, soil conditions than here.
Okay. Does anybody else? Go ahead, Jim.
Can you go over the effect on the private wells in the area? And also, there's the pond there, how this would impact the water quality of the pond that's close by?
Okay, so I respectfully say I can't really respond to the private wells because I don't know where they are. I can tell you in a general sense that
within a mile.
Well, generally a private water supply, if a well yields 5 gallons a minute, that's a pretty successful well. That's residential populations don't really need large wells, so their capture zones are very small. So they're more susceptible to contaminants that just happen to be in the aquifer flowing through. If you do have concentrated discharges, stormwater can be one of those. If it's if you have catch basins that are near a private well, if pollutants, including road salt, get in that, you can have a little localized mounding around that catch basin that can extend some distance from that catch basin. So there is potential, but again, it's more of a regional concern from a private water supply, a private well. It's what's regionally in the aquifer. Again, we don't have a lot of flow velocity there in this area, so things could take a while to show up.
And how about the effect on my comment?
On the pond?
Yeah.
Again, I think if proper housekeeping measures are employed in terms of, landscape maintenance and road salt activities, de-icing activities, unless the intent is for the stormwater to directly discharge to that pond, and even then, I guess if it's managed properly, that's not an uncommon feature. I wouldn't expect that the groundwater issues would be if the pond gets impaired, it may be from sedimentation during construction activities, runoff, when they strip the topsoil to build stuff. There's nothing holding that soil in place. If you get a heavy rain that runs off, you could get sedimentation in the pond. But long term, I wouldn't foresee any significant impacts.
Okay. You okay with that, Jim?
Yeah.
Yep. Would you like to respond to some of these?
Yes, thank you. Don Bracken from Bracken Engineering, the engineer for the project. Don Bracken, Bracken Engineering, the engineer for the project. A few things about the drainage. I think you're going to see in our presentation that we've addressed a lot of the concerns. We're implementing some LID methods for handling the runoff to address not only these comments but previous comments that were brought up at previous meetings. As far as the old school drainage system, maybe it'll be old school after tonight, I don't know, but the drainage system that we started off with in design, it's the same drainage system with catch basins and storm scepters that Comet just installed at their new facility or upgraded facility. Same system as the new police station, same system as the fire station, same system as the intermediate school, even though they had a small rain garden out front. The main parking lot had the same system. So, what we started with was common and acceptable in the town, but we've heard the comments. We think, the site now is redesigned. We can do those LID methods. We do have some challenges still in the residential section that we're going to go through, but there are other things we can implement, to make it a better system, or to meet some of these other concerns that have been raised.
What are the challenges in the residential area?
Well, basically space. For the condos, we created that open space buffer, the 5-foot buffer going around. As I mentioned at the last meeting, we were going to put swales and rain gardens in those areas with leaching systems underneath the parking areas to limit the land disturbance. The rain gardens would be similar to the ones at Sacham's Path, so that they would be revegetated. We planned on using, mainly shrubs and trees if we can, depending on the final design, to help, beef up the buffer zones in those areas. In the residential section, the plan that you're going to see tonight that we're going to go through is going to be a catch basin system going into oil grit separators, large 3,000 to 5,000 gallon tanks, in place of the storm scepters because of the issues that were brought up with the storm scepters and with correspondence back and forth with Mr. Chesia. Technically, that meets the regulations. You get the TSS removal before it goes subsurface. But one other thing we're looking at in addition to that is what they call a storm tree. There's small mini biofilters at each catch basin. Right now, we don't agree with Mr. Chesia on the storm tree analysis and the credit that we can get for it under the regulations. But Tacoma Green is using the storm trees. Horsley Witten just finished the design for that. We've also been talking with Ed Pecci, who's reviewing that design. Not everybody, the stormwater regulations, sort of like zoning bylaws, they're not black and white. People have different interpretations. The regulations aren't written to address every single situation, and you end up with these gray areas. So we're working towards, working out the gray areas with Mr. Chesia. I talked to him again today. We've had emails going back and forth since the last meeting, so they're giving us more direction on, so that we're comfortable on what he's going to agree with when we come up with this final design plan. Again, I'll go over that later. It's still subject to some minor changes, we think. And I understand Mr. Chesia can't meet with us until he has a new contract written, which we're hoping that gets discussed as well. So we're moving forward on that front. We're certainly looking at any way we can to improve the quality of the runoff on the site before it enters the groundwater. The other thing you'll see on this plan, we did add the location of the neighbors' wells to the plan, so those are taken into consideration with the new stormwater system. You'll see that the infiltration system will be at least 100 feet from one of the neighbors' wells, as required in the regulations.
Okay, thank you.
And lastly, the waivers. We did submit revised waivers. They're not part of our presentation. But we haven't asked for any waivers on the zoning bylaw sections, that are referred to in the report. We do plan on infiltrating almost 100% of all impervious surfaces adequately. And we assume that the other bylaw reference had to do with land uses and chemicals and so forth. We assume that those will be incorporated in the final decision, those restrictions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll see the plan a little later. Do we have any other questions at this point? The net in your summary was there isn't a threat to in your opinion, there's not a threat to the water supply from this particular project.
Yeah, the summary is that my opinion is that this product doesn't present an undue threat to the Wannacomet water supply.
Okay, thank you. All right, so.
Just want to add
No.
that we agree to all the summaries that were presented.
Okay, I think again, what we're going to do is go through all the consultants so we so that everybody gets a chance. They've come here twice. I want to make sure everybody gets through. You can ask questions later, not right now. Okay. So
Thank you.
you don't leave. Okay, so let's get right into the other environmental issues. I guess we'll just start with the bats.
First of all, let's make sure you can hear me, and secondly, can you load that for me? Thank you. My name is Kelly Durfee-Cardoza. I'm with Avalon Consulting Group, and I'm here tonight to represent the Select Board in their review of the Surfside Crossing project. And I also have with me two island-based scientists, Sarah Boyce, who's a botanist, and Danielle Odell, who's an ecologist with the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. Both Sarah and Danielle are respected scientists who work with rare species on Nantucket. Sarah studies plants on the island, and Danielle co-authored the first study of the northern long-eared bats and continues to work on understanding the species. So I'll provide an overview for you, but any questions that we have, they'll be able to respond to the species-specific comments. The Select Board engaged us to look specifically at the potential for habitat to exist on the Surfside Crossing project for state-listed vascular plants and the northern long-eared bat, and also to review the ongoing Lepidoptera study that the applicant was conducting. This board's been reviewing the project for quite some time, so where does all of that stand at this point? We know that the site has been mapped as priority habitat by the Massachusetts Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program. Just recently, the state has confirmed that it is habitat for a state-listed special concern species of Lepidoptera, or moth, which is called the coastal heathwood cutworm. The state is also going to require mitigation for impacts to 13.56 acres, which is essentially all of the site, at a ratio of 1.5 acres to 1. The mitigation for the Lepidoptera taking, there are a number of options that the applicant can actually address. The one that they've chosen, according to the communication with Natural Heritage, is land protection of up to 20.24 acres via a conservation restriction. They also have the options of a conveyance and fee of 20.24 acres to a qualified government entity, which would be approved by the state, or funding to a qualified conservation entity to support a natural heritage approved project. So that's what we know about the Lepidoptera study. What we did was look at readily available mapping. We requested from the applicant that we be allowed to conduct surveys at the property. And you might remember last time that at the last hearing, it was noted that access to the site was denied. So the first phase was to look at this readily available mapping. This is by the Nature Conservancy. They mapped the island by cover types in a report which was published in 2002. So this is the Surfside crossing property here in the individual parcels. This portion of the property here is listed as coastal shrubland. There's a small portion down here which is developed, but the remaining portion of the site, the primary portion, is mapped as pitch pine mixed shrub woodland, which the Nature Conservancy has designated as PPSOM. This community is described as mature pitch pine trees and a complex understory of bayberry, huckleberry, and bearberry with some scrub oak. And most importantly to the presence of plants, I think, on this site, they note that there are openings in the canopy where there is herbaceous vegetation. Deer trails and open spots within the site likely provide habitat for state-listed vascular plants, potentially the New England blazing star and the sandplain blue-eyed grass. Both of those are protected species. We have every reason to believe that there is habitat for them at the site, but we haven't been allowed access to conduct that survey. So we did recommend to the Select Board that these areas be surveyed for the presence of New England blazing star. It was blooming at the time of the last hearing. We know that it was also blooming on sites that were, at least one site that was nearby, up in here, which again is a larger area of sandplain grassland, which is open, but based on aerial photography and what we know about this general area, it's likely that there are some open locations within there as well. We took a similar approach to the bats, and that was look at the readily available information and the mapping, and then also look at the aerial photography. So this is an aerial photo of the area. So from the perspective of plants, you can see that there are a couple of open areas that you can see here, a larger one in there as well. So we believe that there's probably the potential for those plants to exist in the seed bank at that location on the property. The science around the northern long-eared bat on Nantucket is still quite young. And I think that's part of the reason that Natural Heritage hasn't been more forceful in asking the applicant to go ahead and look at that. The species was not identified on the island until 2015. And I don't think that anyone believes that they weren't here. It's just that nobody studied them. The northern long-eared bat are listed as endangered by both the federal government and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And it's that same natural heritage staff that we talked about for the Lepidoptera, and they required a full study. The reason that the species is mapped as endangered is primarily because of the emergence and spread of white nose syndrome. Colonies have been impacted by white nose syndrome, and they have a mortality rate of 90 to 99%. The disease spreads quickly, and it's really devastating to that species. Studies have linked the white nose syndrome to a fungus that lives on their fur. What's important about the bat here on Nantucket is that they don't seem to be as impacted by this fungus as in other places. So it's possible that the bats that live here won't come down with white nose syndrome, and for that reason, I think we want to think carefully about how we protect them. So even though the science of northerns on Nantucket is still quite young, there are some things that we know. On Nantucket, they tend to live in pitch pine. The majority of the subject site is pitch pine, and it has a complex understory which is an area that is attractive to bats. Off-island, they tend to live in slightly different habitats, hardwood forests. Not many colonies have been found hibernating here on Nantucket, but we think that they're here. We just haven't found them. They're very small, about the size of my thumb, and they can live in trees. Off-island, they tend to live in caves and mines. You don't have a lot of those here. But we know that from some studies in January, they're finding bats on warm days, and we really don't think that they're coming from off-island. The females tend to live in groups and give birth to 1 pup per year in areas called maternity roosts. They live in very small spaces, like under the bark of trees, and they move around every few days. The pup will rely on the mom from June 1st to July 31st, after which they then fly and they live more independently. You can only identify whether a site has a maternity roost on it, generally between June 1st and July 31st. We weren't engaged to look at the site at that point in time. We haven't been granted access, and it's impossible to know whether the site served as a maternity roost, although we have every reason to believe that it probably did. We've also conducted 2 studies here, acoustic studies, to determine if bats are using the general area at this point in time now, and the answer is that they are. So how does this relate to Surfside Crossing? We know that the majority of the subject site is mature pitch pine, and depending on whether you look at the applicant's first proposal or the second proposal, either 12.5 acres of primarily pitch pine or about 10.8 acres of primarily pitch pine are going to be cleared. The island is about 12% forested and 8% are pitch pine forests. So if the northerns are raising their young in pitch pine here, clearing another 10 acres will eliminate some habitat for them. And again, even though we were denied access to the site on September 19th, at least this group has determined that there were northerns in these areas here. This is land owned by the land bank, and this is land owned by the town. And we know that others have conducted studies in this area and found similar results. It's quite likely that high-quality habitat exists also on this parcel in these areas. And so, again, based on this, removal of the pitch pine will likely result in a take of the habitat for the species. So from a regulatory perspective, if the site was determined to serve as a maternity roost, what would happen? Well, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a 4D rule that applies to bats, and it prohibits the clearing of trees between June 1st and July 31st within 150 feet of a known occupied roost. So we recommend that the ZBA consider treating the site as if it had a maternity roost and ask the applicant not to cut trees within 150 feet of that known occupied area, being the entire site. Okay, I'm hitting this and it's not moving, so bear with me. Okay, so here, thank you. So here's our recommendations. No tree cutting from June 1st to July 31st, or else conduct a study to determine whether the site serves as a maternity roost. If it doesn't, then there wouldn't be a need for that restriction. Map and avoid wherever possible mature pitch pine. From the studies that have been done on the island, we know that around 8 inches DBH is where we tend to see the majority of the northerns roost, and so we'd suggest that you look at the site now. I understand that there are a lot of interests that have to be managed. Rain gardens and other things require clearing, but if there's mature pitch pine here now, I think you need to look at it as an asset for the species and try and keep whatever you can. Similarly, retain the snags that are in the buffer areas. And that would be a long-term operational recommendation so that the people who maintain the property don't go and help. If a tree falls down, leave it there. Don't clear that area. Keep in the buffer zones as much of the native material as you can. There's really a very big difference between a buffer zone that has been cleared and replanted and a buffer zone that is actually material that has not been impacted and has been retained in its existing state. And then finally, we would recommend ongoing invasive species management. Many of the parking areas, at least in the last plan that we saw, were adjacent to this buffer zone, and the buffer zone is not particularly wide. Over time, invasive species will take hold in those areas. We know that the Nantucket Conservation Commission keeps a list of invasive species on the island, and I would recommend that the applicant be asked to conduct some mapping of invasive species now, but also in the future. There may not be a lot here now, but there's a tendency for honeysuckle, autumn olive, things like that to grow adjacent to parking lots, and you'd want to make sure that you keep whatever buffer you have in the best condition that you can. That's all that I have. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you. I don't have any. Does anybody have any questions at this time? No? No? Would you like to respond?
Thank you. Brian Madden from LEC Environmental Consultants. Since the last time I spoke back in July, obviously the moth survey has been completed. Summary report was submitted to Natural Heritage Endangered Species Program for review under MISA project review. Avalon summarized the results of the survey and what Natural Heritage had ultimately concluded based on a review of the existing conditions, the proposed conditions, and the results of the moth survey. We received that determination letter last week, October 19th actually, which reviewed that based on the moth surveys.
Is there an endangered duck in here? Did someone bring their duck?
We're not talking ducks. So.
Sorry, Brian. Go ahead. Probably.
So for all the initial moths that were identified as occurring within the vicinity of the project site, this actual survey concluded that there was one species. Species of special concern, that's the lowest level of protection. Only 3 individuals were found, but that was enough to substantiate a take for that particular species, as Natural Heritage concluded that potential habitat exists on the project site for that particular species. And subsequent to that, we did reach out to Natural Heritage to get some formal clarification or confirmation on what the impact areas would be for the total project site. And just in summary, you know, despite the fact that the project has been more consolidated from an overall development perspective and creating some additional buffers, Natural Heritage is requiring that we mitigate for impacts across the entire project site. So that's that 13.5 acre number, which is the total project site, which corresponds to the mitigation acreage numbers that Avalon had reviewed. I can get into further detail on that, but Natural Heritage had submitted or responded to our email inquiry to confirm the mitigation requirements for off-site obligations. And I'll just summarize it. Off-site mitigation provided through land protection of up to 20.34 acres via conservation restriction or conveyance and fee to a qualified government entity approved by Natural Heritage, and or funding directly to a qualified conservation entity to support a specific natural heritage approved land protection, conservation research, habitat management, or conservation planning project to benefit the coastal heathland cutworm. And basically that was summarized by Avalon. So I believe that addresses the moth questions relative to the bats, northern long-eared bat. Natural Heritage had also provided a response directly to the town. I believe the town had submitted a letter via the select board to Natural Heritage, and Avalon's report was accompanying that letter request to Natural Heritage. And we did forward that correspondence directly from Natural Heritage on the northern long-eared bat subject. And I guess I'll just highlight some of the conclusions there. They did make a note that the 4D rule doesn't specifically apply to roosts or hibernacula that occur in structures where the northern long-eared bats overwinter on Nantucket. Something that we haven't stated, but we have talked internally, and I can memorialize here. We are proposing to have no tree cutting during June and July in accordance with the 4D rule, and as recommended by Avalon. So essentially implementing, and we've relayed that to Natural Heritage, and it was acknowledged in this response to the select board. And basically their conclusion was this time of year restriction would render surveys on or in the immediate vicinity of the project site or the property unnecessary. So again, we are committing to a no cutting time of year restriction between June and July. And then just relative to the vascular plants, state listed vascular plants, Natural Heritage had also responded on that front, acknowledging that the New England blazing star was observed on the Satcham's Path property with an existing sampling grassland heathland habitat, and they were only found within that habitat condition, a habitat condition that does not exist on Surfside project site. And so Natural Heritage delineates priority habitat for state listed species based on current verified observations. So they're aware of the New England blazing star on approximate project site. And they also delineate based on suitable habitat present for the listed species. And based on their conclusion, they've stated that the property does not meet the criteria for mapping as priority habitat for these state-listed plants, and the division will not review the proposed project relative to these species. And that's kind of formalized in their determination letter that was issued October 19th. It was relative to that one particular moth species. That summarizes.
That's it? Okay. I have a couple questions for you. So you looked for and didn't find blazing star?
I've personally been out there during the flowering period and did not observe any.
Okay, so okay. If there were blazing star, would the mitigation change?
It would, in all likelihood, overlap with what our commitments would be for the cutworm.
Would it increase your
No.
over?
They don't double hit you for species. It's whatever your ranking of impact. So it's special concern, threatened, and endangered species.
Got it. So if they're all special concern, not threatened, you're
the 1.5 mitigation ratio would apply still.
okay. In terms of the mitigation, just take us through that a little bit. That can be on the island, it can be off the island, it can be you can donate to any organization that you and Natural Heritage agree to. How does that work? Or what is your preference?
It is our preference to have the mitigation on island, ideally through land protection. But if the funding can be directed towards a conservation group to implement a Natural Heritage approved project, we'd be providing the funding accordingly through Natural Heritage approval. But our preference and intent is to have it on island.
Have you started discussions in any way, shape, or form with anybody on that?
Preliminarily, we did several months back, but hit the pause button on that. And now that we have the finite numbers, then we can take that next step.
Okay. George, this question's for you. Can we, and I think I know the answer, but can we condition relief, if you will, or the comprehensive permit to state that the mitigation has to take place on the island?
They would be able to challenge it as beyond your jurisdiction.
Okay.
I mean, we could try to explore those conditions related to these issues with the developer, first of all, and see if we could get an agreement on it.
Yeah.
And then take it from there. And then the issue from there is where an issue of local concern blends into an issue outside of your jurisdiction. So we'd have to look at it, you know, specifically with respect to the condition and give you an opinion on that. It would certainly be a better way to get conditions that we know would not be appealed by the developer.
Okay. Brian, what's the time frame for getting, or what are the steps to get a final determination from Natural Heritage? You know, the document stating what you do and don't have to do.
Yeah, I mean, the details in the review, we submit a conservation and management permit application. That's the next step in the review process, and once they review the specific mitigation details, they can issue the permit. Timeline, technically, once you submit an application, Natural Heritage has 30 days to provide a response, but I'd say 9 times out of 10, that gets continued to work out the details. So could be somewhat open-ended.
Is it feasible that this portion of the puzzle will be worked out before or concurrently with the rest of what we're talking about?
I think it may be difficult to speculate a specific timeline on that.
Thank you. Okay. My only other question was for the Avalon consultant. A snag is just sort of the down tree, just what I consider a snag?
A broken branch,
Okay.
a down tree, yes.
Got you. Okay. Does anybody else on the board have any questions? Just say no.
Thank you.
Okay. So,
Thanks.
all righty. George, did I miss anything there? You get your chance.
There was just a scheduling concern on the water quality expert. I think he was trying to make a boat. And that if
Okay,
you know,
well,
there were any further questions for him that require his presence, maybe we could try to get those done. And,
there,
you know, and I should note,
timeout.
I should note, Mr. Chair, you know, I would recommend if somebody has a point to make about the consultant's report, maybe they could just make the point as opposed to spending, you know, 20 minutes cross-examining that consultant. If you have a point to make the point. If there's some type of unanswered question that, you know, you're looking for more information, then certainly that question could be posed through you, and you know, the materials could be supplemented. But it'll be a lot more streamlined if people could just make a point if they think that there's some error or inaccuracy in one of the reports or the opinions.
I agree. All right. So having said that, why don't we open it up to the public in terms of the water quality consultant's report. And again, please keep it quick, keep it succinct. Somebody? Nobody? Okay. Perfect.
Hi, sorry. I'm Diane Cabral. I'm a direct abutter. I live at 8 South Shore Road. I just want to go on the record that my well is less than 70 feet away from the project. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ron.
I just have a few questions. Can everybody hear me? This planning board in the town has already approved 1,054 lots that are on this island right now. A lot of them have been here for 30 or 40 or 100 years. Approval
Is
required.
this about the water quality consultant's report? Because you've told us this at the last meeting. And
No,
is there
what
a
I want to
point?
ask is, are you going to put the 1,054 lots that are buildable right here now on this island, throw them out the window to get someone else and approve theirs before then? And I want to ask David Gray and Mark Willett, is there enough water and sewer left for 1,054 lots? And if you put a house and a cottage, that's 2,000. So even with the one house per lot, do you have enough room for 1,054 more use of water and sewer when you already have that solid contamination at the landfill out there? And I've got all the reports here to prove it. With arsenic, the shallow wells and the deep wells are totally contaminated, and that was done by your own company, C.D. Smith, sent to the state. It's right here, and I gave everybody a copy of it, but nobody even looks about it and thinks about it. So what I'm saying is, do you have enough water and enough sewer in your sewer treatment plant, let alone the contamination there, for 1,054 lots that have already been approved by this town, approval required, before you even think about somebody else's? These people have been paying taxes on these other lots for years. So you ought to think about that first.
Make the point.
That's the point. How
Okay.
can you approve
Was
these
there a
when you've
question?
already approved the other?
Could I just, I don't mean to be disrespectful.
Go ahead.
Could we limit the comments and the questions to something that requires the presence of this consultant so that he could make his vote? You have public comments scheduled
You gotta
for
speak
later.
in, you gotta channel your inner
You
rock
have,
star.
you have public comments scheduled for later. It would be good to just address anything that requires the presence of this consultant at this point.
Thank you.
Well, could he answer my question? 1,054 lots?
I
can you
don't
take those?
understand how that's germane, but, you know, again, we're not talking about sewer capacity right now. We're talking about specifically whether or not the water supply would be impacted by this particular development, period. End of discussion. That's what we're talking about right now.
Yep,
So, I mean, if you want to ask the consultant something about whether or not a particle that drops on this particular subdivision travels through the filter, gets into the aquifer, and poisons the well, that's fine. But if you want to talk about I don't know how many lots are left,
Well,
and
I
because
already-
you got here first,
Yeah.
and you were here for the last 50 years doing the same thing, let's talk about that later. We're not talking about it, okay? So, are there any specific questions for the consultant? And
I do.
go ahead.
So in your statement, Mr. Chairman, you said ask fewer questions and like make a statement and then ask a question. So I want to start off by saying that there's a difference, as the consultant has said, between physical capacity and legal capacity. So for example, if I buy a car, it might be able to go 200 miles an hour, but I can't drive it at 200 miles an hour down Milestone Road because there's a thing called a speed limit. So my first question then would be,
Get to the point,
that
please.
the limitation on the water supply is 1.68 million gallons. Is that not correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, we have served public records requests on the water company, and they are unable to produce any permit to that effect. They do have a permit that expired in 2013 for 1.68 million gallons, but they have not been able to produce a current valid water withdrawal permit.
Thank you. You finished?
No, that's not a question.
That's actually not true. The department head, the department head is here, and that's not true. Is that? All right. And again, can we cover? Maybe the consultant could just leave now, because if we're going to cover issues like this,
We don't
there's
seem
no
to be
reason
asking
for him to
many
miss his vote.
questions. All right, what I'd like to do also, Paul, why don't you go to that mic so that the consultant can stand at this mic, and there doesn't... Good. Thank you. Yeah, he's gonna.
Paul, just go to the other mic, please.
Does not work?
No, let's let Mr. Durensis finish. One at a time.
So Mr. Chair, I just want to reiterate a couple of points. Okay, now we've spent a lot of public hearing time just hearing about extraneous issues, and you've given the public a lot of leeway.
Please don't interrupt. Nobody interrupted you.
Now, you have public comment. You have public comment specifically listed on the agenda for tonight, just like you have all the way along. Everybody can make whatever point that they want by way of the public. This has to do with just the courtesy of having a physical presence of somebody who has a vote to make. And the reason that I think you can hear my voice, right? And now the other issue that I corrected Mr. Durensis is, we're not going to sit down and we're going to listen to something that isn't correct about what was produced by the town, okay? Now, the town department head just told me that the permitting issue that Attorney Durensis just referred to is simply not correct. And we're not going to sit back in the cause of due process to let people just say things that aren't correct and not get corrected. So if we have to hear from the department head to correct what was said, then I recommend that you do that. But we're not going to sit down and listen to misinformation being provided. And that's the way that I'm trying to guide you tonight, so that we can stay reasonably on track on issues within your jurisdiction and come up with a permitting decision within the time deadline that you're operating under. So that's the guideline that I would request that we make. And in terms of this water consultant, whatever points need to be made appear to be able to be made in their own comments, or they can submit something in writing or make them tonight. But I'm not seeing anything that requires the physical presence of this particular consultant here as a matter of due process for the public to be able to comment on this project.
Thank you. Having said that, I'm hopeful the consultant can stay until the last vote. When the meeting's going to adjourn at 7:45, one way or the other. No, I'm talking right now. Can you wait a minute?
When you're done, I was going to ask a question.
Well, I see you.
I understand.
But you're giving me this. I see
I was
you.
speaking to Mr. Durensis.
I haven't finished the question.
I'm aware that you haven't finished the question. So anyway, the consultant's going to stay. The meeting is going to adjourn at 7:45. I'm just letting everybody know that. Go ahead, Paul.
We have received documents from the town of Nantucket. They are not as characterized by Mr. Pucci. We will put those documents into the record at the next session. But in the meantime, the point that was being made was that there is a limit, a legal limit of 1.68 million gallons, and I believe the consultant would say that at this point in time, this project would add a load to that 1.68 million that would put the water usage in excess of that legal limit. Is that correct?
That's not technically correct, no. So what he's referring to is a Massachusetts Water Management Act permit. The Water Management Act program requires permitting of any public water supply in excess of 100,000 gallons per day. Technically, a permit of 1.68 million gallons per day on average wouldn't, a water system would not have to apply for a new permit until they exceeded that 1.68 million gallons per day by that 100,000 gallons per day, called the threshold volume. So technically, once they exceeded 1.78 million gallons per day, they would be in violation. They would be required to have a permit for that additional 100,000 gallons per day. In practice, the department frowns on people exceeding their allotment, their Water Management Act permitted volume by substantial amounts for extended periods of time. The other thing is that Massachusetts in 2010, 2009, embarked upon what's called the Sustainable Water Management Initiative. That multi-year process essentially halted the department's ability to issue new permits. That, coupled with 2008 economic crisis, the governor at the time, by fiat, extended all permits for 2 years. All permits that were then in place, whether they expired during that period or not, were extended for 2 years. So a permit that expired in 2015 was extended to 2017. 2 years later, they extended it by another 2 years. So it is not at all clear to me that the water company's permit has expired, which I don't believe it has, and the department itself has acknowledged that they are way behind in issuing permits. There are permits that have been administratively extended all over Massachusetts because the department can't get to them. So technically, that is not a factual statement.
Isn't it true that that's a legal issue and not a hydrological issue? And that you are a
Why are you asking him that?
hydrological expert?
Well, it is. It's a permitting issue, but that's why I broke up my discussion in what the hydraulic capacity is, which is about 6 million gallons per day, which is 3.5 times what their authorized volume is. So the authorized volume, which is what you're referring to, is an issue for sure that the state is grappling with just statewide.
And are you aware that the water company has exceeded that permit over the last 3 years?
I am aware that they are in the vicinity of their permit. They've exceeded and they've been under, but they're very close to it. And I mean, I'm speaking for Mark, which I probably shouldn't be, but that they are in the process. They've had conversations with the state about additional volumes.
But you have not.
It's not my job.
Please. I don't understand where you're going with this. I mean, if you want to ask Mark a question about the capacity, which we've gone over, or if you think it's a legal point, make the legal point later. It's not, this isn't the forum. We're trying to gather information.
I'm trying to just get him back to what he said in his written report, which was the capacity was 1.68, that's an issue, and that the water company is at that capacity. That's what you said in your report.
I also said that the water company's consultant, water supply consultant, has issued an opinion that they have sufficient capacity.
Physical capacity.
Correct. The state has not issued new permits. So Mark has the water company they couldn't have gotten an increase in authorization that they are seeking because the state has not issued any permits.
I think
I'm sorry,
the
that's
consultant.
not technically true, but they have not issued permits here. They're filtering out draft permits for communities piecemeal.
So these are questions that need to be asked of the state. I don't think this is the consultant's within his, I mean, he's speaking of opinion, but it's not his.
I do have knowledge, but it's
Right,
not what
right.
you asked me to look at.
Right. So Paul, I think we've definitely gone over this. We went over it at length at like 2 meetings ago, I believe. We have 1 hour and 45 minutes left. There are a lot of people, you have gotten a lot of time at the mic. There's a lot of people who haven't had a chance, so I would like to continue on, and I think the rest of the board would agree with me so that we can get to all the people who have come here.
Thank you. Cormac?
It's a great look. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Cormac Collier for the Executive Director of the Nantucket Land Council. Just a quick question, and perhaps it's through you to Town Council. Acting as the Wanna-Comment Water Commission, that's what you're going to be acting as, correct? First question, so thus you have to issue a permit for that connection for the amount of gallons that they're expecting. It is germane whether you're allowed to do that under the existing permit. It's probably not a question for the consultant in terms of capacity, but I believe you do have to issue that, and you have to basically determine whether you are within a legal right to actually do that, considering we have some conflicting information that they don't have a valid permit from the state. And I would like to get into stormwater at some point.
So I think that's a great question, and we should have clarification. I think that's something Town Council could clarify for us either tonight if you know the answer, or with the state agency.
Clarify tonight, absolutely. You're acting as that board.
No, but do we have
board.
the right to issue a permit is what he's asking, if it's over
Yeah,
the
you would
1.68.
treat it the way the water company would treat any other applicant. So you're going to have to act in an equal manner. We can address that as a valid issue about the capacity and what's going on with Mass DEP. But again, we were trying to keep on track to the issues that the water quality consultant was talking about. That would be a different issue. But yes, absolutely, you're acting in the shoes of this water department, and you would need to make that determination whether that would be illegal for you to grant that connection.
Right,
but keep in mind, if the town is granting other connections that would allegedly exceed this permit, then you would need to treat this applicant the way you're treating other similarly situated applicants.
Right, and I think we've heard from the that they do, but
Correct.
I think what we're asking, or I think what Cormac was asking for is clarification from the state that we can actually do that.
It would be probably a good idea to seek clarification from the state, although my understanding is it would be nice to hear from him that he has ongoing communications with the state on the issue.
Yes, we do have, Mark Willett, Wanna-Comment Water. We do have communication with DEP. We are in compliance. They are working, as the consultant said, on issuing permits all over the Commonwealth. There is no moratorium on water connections. We are putting in 4 or 5 a week. They have not shut it down. They realize what's going on here. They have all the information about the growth and the development. They're diligently working on the permit. We have a letter from 2016 that gives us 5% more than the 1.68 until they figure it out. The number they've told us is we're going to be at a 1.9 million gallons per day on our permit when it is issued. But there is no moratorium on connections.
Thank you. I'd just like to say, we're not shutting down any discussion about this type of issue, the water capacity, whether or not we're acting as Wanna-Comment Water. We're just not there yet. We're trying to get through these consultants so that we actually have a reasonable amount of information so that we can get to those points. So every time that somebody, we get let's say a little off track, it's just a little frustrating, because I would love somehow to get through the consultants, get the information, and then begin to have a discussion with the public, with ourselves, as to where we might go with it, whether it's a denial, whether it's an approval with conditions. We haven't decided anything. Thank you, Mark. So if the public has anything specific about water quality.
I'm Maureen Phillips. I live at 30 Long Pond in Nantucket, and I'm looking at the consultant's report, so I hope this is germane to the consultant being here. So, what I had trouble understanding, given the presentation by the consultant and also something that the gentleman from Bracken said, was, let's see. So again, this gets to the capacity issue, but this is in his report, so I think it's germane to him being here and being able to speak to this. But on page 4 of their report, that is the version that's in the town, on the town website, it states that to date, so they talk about the 1.68 million gallons, and says that the water companies below that during the fall, winter, and spring, but above in the summer. Then it says, to date, the water company has been able to supply the demand while remaining at or slightly above its authorized withdrawal. However, and this is the sentence that caught my eye, however, increasing demand from this project and others means the water company will be required to either implement water conservation policies, excuse me, or seek a permit for additional withdrawal volume in the near future. And I have trouble reconciling that statement with the, what I heard were assurances that, you know, this is all just fine and not a problem, but conservation measures, you know, that doesn't sound like a nothing issue. So I would love to hear the consultant talk about what he meant when he wrote that language, because I'm having trouble putting it, having it make sense and be consistent with what we've heard already. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I think even Mr. Willett just explained that they are in the process of seeking an additional volume in that permit. So, you know, this is that information is, you know, was new to me. So had I had that information, I said they are in the process of seeking, not they will need to seek. In terms of water conservation measures, you're all doing them now anyway. They're just, you know, they're talking about low flush toilets. We're talking about sometimes there's moratoriums or issues with outside irrigation, odd even watering, or some communities are forced into a position of having complete and total bans on outdoor watering during the summer. But there's there's nothing particularly frightening about water conservation. It just becomes more formalized as we move along. Most communities and Mark is a responsible system operator, most responsible system operators encourage water conservation. There are mailers in your bills that say, you know, please conserve water. That's a water conservation measure. The idea is that, you know, water's a finite or precious resource, and, you know, we don't want to waste it. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Well, it does. It's useful because it's additional to what you had in the actual report. So it's good we can have this back and forth, and it's been hard for me to hear everybody talking, so I may have missed that bit about that they are going to be applying again. But oh, I'm sorry. Oh, Lord, here I'm the one always yelling about people not being heard. Anyway, so I just said that was useful to have this exchange because I didn't understand what was in here, and now I hear, okay, they're going to apply for another permit. But that to me is like, well, we've been reassured so often that there's no capacity issue, you know, yada da. So this gets confusing to me. Oh, well, they do have to apply for another permit. And so, I'm having trouble putting this in a consistent framework. And then actually in that same page, you went on to say, let's see. So you gave your opinion that you quoted Haley and Ward, and then about the Winnacommet Water Company's supply and storage capacity. And then, but you said they may have difficulty staying within their Mass DEP authorized volume now and into the future. So that gets to getting the new permit? Okay. But then it says this, now here's and this is a sentence I just did not understand. This appears to be more of a systemic issue with some aggressive demand projections provided by the regulatory agencies that may significantly underestimate the summer population on the island. So if it's an aggressive demand, but it's underestimating the summer population, so could you explain that?
Sure. So I allowed myself during that report to throw a small lob in the direction of Mass DEP. So we can all say what we use. Mark can tell the state what he uses, what his summer population is. Unfortunately, they take most of the local communities' data and information on what population is with a bit of a grain of salt. The state, through the Department of Conservation and Recreation, another agency within the Commonwealth, does demand projections. And they look at data, they look at census data, and they look at other information, and then sometimes do a little fudge factor and say, well, we think you're gonna only need this much water. It is in almost 100% of the cases less than the community thinks they need. So my comment there is that Mark and you all know what the summer population is. I mean, we had the issue with the traffic a month ago. You know, some people say the traffic is this, and other people say, well, I know it's a lot worse than that. Water, you know, the local information, you know, the local impressions of what the summer population is, and then what Mark's obligation to supply that population is sometimes different than what they calculate in Boston. That said, you know, Mark does what he has to do to provide water for people. Unfortunately, I work with communities where the physical capacity is a problem. They don't have the physical capacity to supply as many, you know, their population. That right now is not a problem here. It's a challenge in peak day in the summer, but generally, he has 5 excellent wells and some new water tanks, and there's a lot of capacity. He's done a very good job running the system. So I don't know if that clarifies that point, but it was really, I do believe, and I think there are a number of us in our industry believe that there is a systemic problem at the state with how they calculate future water demand. That's what you meant. That's what I meant.
I appreciate that. Sorry, I appreciate that. And the last thing I wanted to clarify, and I'm sorry, but this is just, I am not a water engineer. I'm just a lawyer, and we don't know anything about water engineering. At least I don't. Sorry. So that talking about future concerns, and because you mentioned this project and others, and that we do have, there's other development going on all the time and what have you. So I think it's a general question that I'm hoping the ZBA and wearing your ZBA hats and your Water Commission hats as well, looks at the projected growth for the island, and as you mentioned, this project and others. So I think that's something that really needs to be thought about. This place isn't going to freeze. If this thing goes through, that doesn't mean the end of development on Nantucket. And so I think all of us here are very concerned about how we plan going forward, and you all are really critical to this. And so addressing that issue as you're going through all of this, I think is really important, because you've got this important dual role. And so, and we've got the people working here on the ground in town, but I just am concerned that this project keeps getting looked at as if it were standing alone somehow, and it's not. And we all know that. So I would like us to address that. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Peter Fenn, Nantucket Land Council. I was only going to ask before if we were going to get to address stormwater management at a later date, because some stuff was said about swales and infiltration. I didn't want to miss an opportunity. So that was what I was trying to ask before. But on water supply, I'll come back to that question in a minute. On water supply, I do want to respectfully disagree with George. I think you can look at this differently than other water hookups of a lot here and a lot there for a couple of reasons. You are the comprehensive permit granting authority. You're sitting as the Wanacana Water Company. You're sitting as the Zoning Board of Appeals and the Planning Board and everybody else. And this project is a comprehensive permit under 40B. You have, and I don't need to tell you what your responsibilities are. I'm sure George will, to the extent you don't already know them well. But there are several issues you look at, including health and safety and environmental. And this project is a special permit, and you're charged with looking at those issues with respect to this project. The Wanacana Water Company is in charge of that responsibility when it issues a hookup for a single-family home. You can look at this differently. This is 100 or 125 or 160 or however many units. It has a major impact. It's a comprehensive permit. You need to look at it in that context. As such, it's almost as though you're coming and saying existing lots of record might be treated differently than newly created lots if there was a moratorium on water hookups, for example. You can look at this differently. It's not like every other water hookup permit that you grant, and you have every right and every obligation to do just that.
Thank you.
Mindy Levin, 10 Folger Avenue. I wanted to ask if I should be worried as a current homeowner. I do not have a permit in to hook up to water or sewer. I'm on septic. I'm not part of one of the developments. Should I be worried if in 3 or 4 years or 5 years, if my septic tank, my water, town water is, my well water, thank you, is contaminated or I need to hook up to town water? Should I be worried that it's not going to be easy or possible for me to do in several years if that becomes necessary? I said that last month. I hear everyone talking about the permits that are out there and all the developments that are under consideration, but we haven't talked about all of the houses that are currently on well water that are going to eventually, if we need to, hook up.
Another legitimate question.
Check.
Is that working?
So that is part of the reason why our permit is being held up for so long at DEP. All this information has been given to them. And we are not the only community in the Commonwealth dealing with this kind of growth. The whole Cape and Islands is going kind of through what we're going through in the development. And we've given them numbers and projected numbers on subdivisions and build-outs and different projects that are going on. And they're working with that. It's not the amount of water that we have, it's mechanically getting it out of the ground, and what people need to remember is the Commonwealth owns the resource. What the consultant talked about, DCR, DCR thinks we have about 15 to 20,000 people here in the summer. That's pretty close to our winter population, I think. We've given them new data from information from, I think it was Worcester Polytech this summer, over the 50,000 or the high 40,000 number that they came up with summer population. So they're looking at all the new information we're giving them to come up with a permit number. But they're to try to pick a magic number out there to say, okay, we can do 1,000 more connections, or there might be 1,500 more connections. That we don't know that. The supply is there. It's mechanically getting it out of the ground. If that means another well, or another tank, or more pipe, that's an option. But I can't stand up here and say that there's a certain number that we can do.
Based on your projected revised permit number of 1.9 something million, is there a number of additional housing units attached to that number?
Yes, there are, and now there's been more submitted to them over the last year. So this has been going on for, as the consultant said, several years now. This, I think, was actually supposed to be done in like 15.
Do you have that number? I mean, how many more additional units could be built?
Just the projects that are currently going on, I think there's 700 possible new connections.
But what could you do in total based on that 1.9 something?
We could handle everything that's, and this is included.
This
the
is
1.9.
included, and then you have
the Old
something-
South Road development is included, Hawthorne Park, Bartlett Road, the subdivision going on there. We have 16 subdivisions that some are underway already, some haven't started. They have all that information. The 1.9 could handle that. And
And that
it's our
includes-
responsibility if it can't, then we would put on a Tuesday, Thursday watering schedule. Or we would restrict outside water use in some way to keep that number at the 1.9. If we can prove that we have experienced tremendous growth beyond what everybody expected, there's a negotiation process with DEP, a new application, and that 1.9 is increased. In fact, they would let us go to the next 5-year projection, which is 2.01 or 2.1 million gallons a day, and we could go there sooner. So the permit that we've applied for, it's called a 20-year permit. For us, by the time we get it, it's probably going to be a 16-year permit. They run it in 5-year increments, and each 5 years they increase you by about 15, maybe a little over 15%. So if we're at the 1.9 in 4 years from now, I get in touch with them and say, you know, we're still experiencing growth. We have homeowners that need the water supply. We would bounce to that next number up.
Mark, is this working?
Of course it is. Anyway, Mark, we've heard from you now twice, and maybe a third time that I forget, but would it be reasonable for you to put a summary together on paper and so that we can read it, we can have it, the public can have it, because all these numbers are bandied about, and it's hard to keep track of it all. So
Definitely do that, yes.
I think that would be helpful for everybody. And then to the last speaker's question, you've factored in all the new subdivisions and whatnot, but her well goes kaput. Is there anything that's going to preclude her from getting a connection?
So part of those projections with all the growth going on and all the numbers and the development we're seeing, they have that. Plus they have the 100 to 110 new connections we do every year and have for the last 4 or 5 years.
Okay.
And as part of those 105 to 110, there might only be 90 real new connections that we're counting on as new construction. And then we leave 10 or 15 for situations like that where you can make a connection where it's needed for safe drinking water purposes only.
Thank you. So I think it would be very helpful. How does everybody feel about that?
I agree.
Yeah, we can put that together for you.
Thank you. Okay.
Ed, I have a question for the consultant. If we were maxed out and the developer couldn't tie in, would they be able to drill their own well? And with the space and with a wellhead area to support their own capacity?
So there's a two-part question. Would they be able to drill their own well? Absolutely. There are lots of condo complexes that are public water suppliers. There's different categories of public water supplier. They're all regulated by the Clean Water Act. They're defined by the Clean Water Act. Transient, non-community. There's several of them. But yes, they would be a public water supplier. They would be subject to. They would be less than 100,000 gallons a day, so they would not need a Water Management Act permit specifically. DEP may try to pressure them or push them in that direction to get one, but they would be responsible for providing clean, safe drinking water to the residents.
Okay, so it is an option.
That is an option. Yeah.
I have a follow-up to Jim's question, which I think he asked. So you put the well in. You're supplying your own water. What's the radius around the well that you need to maintain it's cleared?
So it's the log of the, if it's 100,000 gallons a day, it's 400 feet. It shrinks down to as little as 250 feet at 50 gallons a minute or 40 gallons a minute or something to that effect. But then between there's a formula. It's the log of the
Okay.
pumping rate
Between
in
200
gallons per
and
day.
400 feet?
Yeah.
Is
So
that
my guess
safe?
is, looking at, their demand, their number of bedrooms, they'd need around 35,000 gallons per day or 40,000 gallons per day. Probably be about 280 feet, 300 feet.
Okay, thank you. You good with that, Jim? That answer you? Okay.
So, and just to be clear, that's called the Zone 1. That's a regulatory radius around the wellhead. And only things that are directly related to the pumping and production of that water are allowed in that zone. So that's a pumping station, that's treatment, pipes, but no residential. You can have passive recreation. You can't have picnic tables. They don't want any place where people can congregate. So that zone essentially becomes protected and unusable.
All right, so if indeed in our capacity as the Wanacoma Water Company, we decided we did not want to issue the permit, the applicant would certainly have the option to put his own well in.
Yeah, that's an option. Whether it's feasible, that's for that.
Yeah,
But,
and obviously the plan would have to change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay.
Yeah, I got up here. I was going to say the same thing. Obviously, under the current plan, it's not feasible for the project under the current plan. The other thing I would like to add, because there was discussion about water conservation, I think we'd mentioned it before, but we will have wells on site for irrigation, so there won't be any demand from the irrigation system itself. And then the other thing I'd like to do is correct the last statement I made that, we agree with the summaries. I meant to say we agree with the recommendations that were in the report.
Thank you. In terms of the wells they would go into the same aquifer, correct? There's only one, right, or two? But,
It's the same aquifer, but it wouldn't be the same zone 2
Right.
that we're dealing with. Right.
Could you at least examine the notion of cistern to collect as part of your stormwater recharge system, where you would?
We can examine it. Obviously, it's very complicated to have each house on its own cistern and irrigation system when we plan to irrigate the entire project as one type of irrigation system. So
Well, again, maybe some of these details are going to be fleshed out because we didn't know. Or you probably said it, but I didn't realize that it's one big irrigation system for the entirety. So.
Yes, that's the plan. Yeah.
At night, everybody's irrigation comes on at the same time? It's one zone. One zone? Or, well, it'd be multiple zones,
right.
but I feel like it's the Truman Show or something, right?
I don't know. I can't speak to the specific details like that, but.
All right, but I think that's the point. We need more details about stuff like that. But having said that, go ahead, Jack.
I'm Jack Weinhold. We're abutters to the south shore, the south border of Surfside Crossing. Our well is 10 feet off the line. I'd like some assurance from the consultant that I don't have some worries going into this project.
How deep is your well? How deep is your well? 65 feet. Well, I mean, I really was hoping you were going to say, I don't know, because most people don't. With all due respect, I can't give assurances to anything. It's really would be inappropriate for me to do that. I don't know that somebody's, I can't be, I don't know what people are going to do on the site, right? So I can tell you that under expected conditions, it's unlikely that there would be a problem, but I mean, if people's septic systems are 100 feet from their wells and nobody thinks twice about it, so I'm not sure. I'm not really sure how to answer that question, to be perfectly honest with you.
I have a follow-up. What could cause contamination, hypothetically?
So hypothetically, there are the obvious things are, as I've mentioned 1,000 times, the de-icing activities. Road salt is a problem, and it's a problem everywhere in where it snows. you could have an automobile accident that releases fuel, gasoline. I mean, I don't know how this facility is going to be heated. If it's, you know, if it uses heating oil, you could have a heating oil tank rupture or a delivery problem, you know, where a delivery hooks up to the wrong pipe and pumps oil into the ground. I mean, there are lots of things that could happen. You know, nothing, you know, specific. You know, they do require, you know, the stormwater handbook, and they talk about the first flush, managing the first flush, and that's generally because the first flush of rainwater carries with it pollutants that land on the roads. That's not you know, that's not news to, well, shouldn't really be news to anybody, and that can be, you know, it could be, you know, oils and greases from the vehicles. It could be microparticles of rubber, tire, you know, tire particles. But, you know, by far the most likely would be pesticides and fertilizers from misapplication or somebody not being careful.
Thank you.
Question that directly relates to what he just said.
Go ahead.
Sure. So
Just identify your
sorry, Megan Perry. The force main line that runs underneath that property, right? Would that affect his well if that were to break?
I don't know. I don't know where his well is in relation to that force main, but that would be a problem for lots of folks, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Just thank you. Oh.
The question was if the force main bursts,
breaks,
cracks, leaks, would it be a problem for the well? It would be the answer was it would be a problem for a lot of people, for a lot of reasons.
Let me clarify too. That's, I mean, I assume you're referring, it's the treated wastewater effluent that goes.
Main force lines that run through that property right next to his.
That's wastewater, right?
Correct. Yep.
Right. Is that pre or post treatment? On treatment, yes. That would be a problem for lots of folks.
Thank you.
I just want to add one thing to all of
Again,
this.
just identify yourself.
Sorry, Dave Glowacki. Everybody is under the impression that everything's going to go as planned in this whole situation. And a lot of people don't know this, probably, but over at the Beach Plum Village, which these guys did, something very unintentional happened, but it is something that could do a lot of damage to a lot of people's well water. They had a crane come in to set one of the houses of the however many, I don't know, that leaked oil all the way from its trip in from Fairgrounds Road, down Rugged Road, into the right, into Beach Plum Village. It had to have been hundreds, if not 1,000 gallons of oil. That, after it rains, is going to end up in the ground at any site. Something like that could happen. I'm not saying it will, but these are the things that you can't just expect are going to go as planned in all of these great sounding plans.
Thank you.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
All right, so there wasn't anything close.
Yeah.
There wasn't anything close to the amount of hydraulic fluid that was just indicated by Mr. Glowacki. There was a crane that showed up that was dripping. And as soon as we noticed that it was dripping on the property, we got spill kit underneath it. And we're talking like a couple gallons at the most, and we reported it and we made a big deal about it. And, you know, so that's the extent of that.
I don't know how any of us can make any judgment by somebody that lies to your face.
Okay, all right. Let's just stop that one right there. Mr. Zemicki.
Jacques Zemicki, a butter. My well is located 20 feet from the property line on the south side. We pump about 30 gallons a minute for probably about 8 hours in the summer for irrigation, and that's a pretty good drawdown. When you pump, it just creates a cone, and so the velocity of the water at the edge of the cone accelerates downhill to the pump. And groundwater, a couple things. When you're talking about the flow towards the well fields for the public water supply, that's sort of going uphill, right, with the gradient? Is that correct? Because the gradient there would be, the mound would be about 8 feet underneath, and they get up to 12 feet.
Yeah, I don't believe, I don't, Mark, you know what static water is at the milestone? Yeah, so that's correct.
A couple clarifications. One is that we didn't really address water that just is on the surface going before it hits the aquifer, how quick it goes into the ground. There's lots of mitigating circumstances like clay layers, et cetera. But in Nantucket, that happens pretty quick. We were talking about, the 50-year timeline to get it to the well field. But there are any number of studies on the upper aquifer that have given horizontal velocities of water between 200 and 700 feet a day. And these might be very geologically particular to the area in which they were observed. But that's one of the things with the aquifer is that we just don't know. There hasn't been enough mapping of the aquifer. And I don't really dispute the fact that an oil spill on top at next door or on my property is going to get into the public water supply very, very soon, in my lifetime for sure. But the way other particles, we're talking about oil, the way other particles, micropollutants, move through the aquifer is different, and they move quicker. Aquifers are using the, what was it, your constant was 0.6 feet a day?
Seepage velocity?
Yeah, seepage.
0.3.
Yeah, and so and I don't want to say that's a static issue because aquifers really are living, and as the tide goes up, there's they go up and down, there's a lot of movement in them, and there's a lot of circulation. A lot of that is not really well understood. And that's where we are. So I think there's some question about horizontal velocity and pollutants. As a person that has their well 20 feet away, I'm very concerned about pollutants, and my drawdown would be under the proposed or the amended dry wells that they're using right now.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. On the next submittal from the applicant, I think you should show the neighboring wells, and maybe you did that.
You did. It's next set. Yeah, we'll go through that.
Go through that today.
Hopefully.
We'll see.
We'll hit that first then, when I get up?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, good. So maybe we'll get better clarity as to separation from your well to any potential pollutants, et cetera. So anyway, is there anything else for the consultant?
One more question. Diane Cabral. I'm just curious about the surrounding wells. Does it have an impact on our water pressure if they put in a well, or if, what their usage, does it affect our surrounding wells?
You could, if they're pumping at very high capacities, you will induce a cone of depression, a depressing of the water table. Will it be noticeable to you and your well? Not likely, because we'd be talking about maybe a foot or two of additional drawdown that you'd see at your well. And one of the things that he referred to, the drawdown in the well. Now, I don't know what size diameter well he has, but wells are inefficient. The smaller the well they are, the more inefficient they are. So what you see inside the well is not really a good representation what you see, what is immediately outside the well. Because as the water is coming into the well, it is speeding up dramatically as it tries to, you're pulling from a cylinder basically coming in. And as that cylinder gets closer to the well, the cylinder gets smaller and smaller, but the same amount of water is going through it. So the velocity speeds up. And when you get into the well, because there's screens and wells that are out here where our screen have sand and gravel, Those well screens are typically, because they're in a, well drillers put cheap, they're not engineered like Mark's well screens are, probably. And so there's a lot of friction losses coming from the aquifer into the screen, and that causes the water level in your well to drop far beyond what it is in the aquifer immediately outside the well. So, it could, if they were pumping at a very high rate for a very long period of time and that cone extended to your property, I can't tell you. I'd have to do a hydrogeologic analysis, and they take time to do. But there is that cone of depression, which I was referring to in the Zone 2 analysis, how that expands out. Could eventually come, but we might be talking about 6 inches to a foot. Maybe, I don't know, just that's sort of a guesstimate based on how permeable I know the materials are out here. So,
Does that answer your question?
There was a section of the report that dealt with wastewater that he didn't articulate as part of his presentation, but I do have a question about one sentence in there, if I might. There's a sentence that says, this is on page 6 of his report, under the title wastewater. So we're talking about wastewater and not drinking water. The sentence is that peak flows in summer can be as high as 8,000 gallons per minute for multiple hours. And so I took 8,000 gallons per minute. I took 24 hours a day times 60 minutes per hour, got to the notion of there's 1,440 minutes in a day, and I multiplied it times 8,000. And so my question is, to just translate that 8,000 gallons per minute into a rate. The rate is at the rate of 11.5 million gallons. Is my math correct?
Yeah, you can make it easy by multiplying the gallons per minute by 1.5, and you get roughly 12. But it's precisely the reason I put it in multiple hours and not 12 million gallons per day, because I don't see that. But they do have peak flow rates that are high. Then this is just from conversations with the wastewater superintendent. But to my knowledge, they've not seen a 12 million gallon per day.
And just confirm to me that the rated legal capacity of the plant is 4 million gallons per day. Is that correct?
That's yes.
Thank you. Did you have some, Peter?
Yeah, I guess what I was going to say, maybe what's happening, that we have finished that topic. I know with the difficult agenda, difficult time frame. Commend you and thank you for trying to move it along, and that's all I really wanted to do, because again, thinking of the public as well as the applicant, we do have further presentation, including that question as to the location and proximity of the wells. So I think the next thing on the agenda is for our presentation, which I think everybody, including the public, would be interested in. So that's all I was going to say.
Yeah, we unfortunately, we need to speak to the bats and the natural heritage first, so then we'll get to your presentation.
You mean from the public?
Yeah.
I in no way mean to step on your toes or the public. I certainly appreciate and respect the need for questions. I just thought that it makes sense, since we responded to requests at the last hearing, that the public would be interested in seeing it. If you, again, if you want to have public comments on the consultant Avalon's report, that's fine.
But-
I
but-
do
but-
urge
but
that it, I
let's-
do urge that it be limited, because there has been a
Yeah.
tendency, which I understand, I don't mean in any way disrespecting the public, but there has been a big tendency for redundancy and extraneous things. That's all I would like to urge.
Thank you. But I think we're going to go there. Are we finished with the water quality? I think so. Okay. So now we're on to natural heritage and, well, natural heritage. That's where we are.
On the natural heritage thing, there was a reference to a letter. I'd like to have that be part of the record of this proceeding. Would like to,
Who's the letter to and from?
it's a letter, it's a determination letter dated October 19, 2018 to Surfside Crossing from the Division of
Yeah, that's fine.
Fisheries and
We'll put it in the
Wildlife.
record. You have a question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, Bruce Perry, 14 and 16 South Shore Road. And I'd like to talk about that natural heritage determination that you guys just got. I'm trying to talk into the mic. How about now? Really good.
Think
Okay.
Lady Gaga.
I try not to. So, just to walk you through, it helps to put my glasses on, 'cause I can see what I wrote. All right, so what I just gave to the chairman is the final determination from Natural Heritage on the request from the applicant as to whether or not there's a take on the property. Okay, and Natural Heritage determined that there was a take. All right, so it's up to the applicant to mitigate it. Okay. So let me just go through a bullet list. The project is in priority habitat, which you all know. It will result in a take of a state-listed species, and it will alter in excess of 2 acres of priority habitat. And since almost the entire property is priority habitat, that comes to 12+ acres of alterations. Because it takes up because it alters more than 2 acres of priority habitat, they are required by MEPA to file an ENF, environmental notification form. Okay? And until that process is finalized, they can do no work on the property, disturb it in any way, digging, stuff like that. So it goes to the question that you're all asking right there, going, why does this matter to the ZBA that they have to go through this other process? First, the process is going to take, well, we'll call it 6 months. By the time they do an ENF, then followed by an EIR, and all this kind of stuff. The state is through this process may require changes to the plan in the number of dwellings, the location, the mitigation, to assume that they're going to allow off-site mitigation for the entire project, and find 24 acres on Nantucket that is available to be permanently protected, that is not currently protected. It does not do you any good to go to the land bank and say, we'll take 24 acres of your property, because it is already protected open space. So they're adding no benefit to the species by grabbing their land, or even the Conservation Foundation. Okay. So, statement change plan. Okay. So it's going to take, we'll assume 6 months on the short end of it. In that time, we'll come to another growing season. The applicant can then do a real survey for state-listed plants on the property. I was involved in the plant surveys for the Sachem's Path project and for the My Comet Village expansion, and found state-listed species, not just New England blazing star, on both properties. As a matter of fact, some of them are pretty close to the property line of this project. To just go through and walk the property when the blazing star is in bloom is not a scientific survey of whether or not the plants are present. Some of the photographs included in Mark Mello's Lepidoptera study show some potential habitat for these state plants. Unrelated to his project, you can just look at the habitat and say they may be there. So Natural Heritage required, as part of Sachem's Path, that a scientific study be done. They gave certain parameters. We had to define how we were going to look at it and give a report to them. Then once we found the plant, the applicant had to develop a mitigation plan and then implement it. All this is going to take way more than just January of 2019, when the deadline for this project is. So I would suggest that in light of all this delays and potential delays, because again, if you're going to change the project after going through, well, I don't know how many hours we've been here already, but it certainly will double that, another 30 hours of public hearings, just to come back in 6 months and make more changes to it, there'll be 30 more hours of public hearings. I would suggest that the board maybe take some time off from this project, let the applicants go through the state process, get a final determination from MEPA on this project. And that includes a real plant survey, maybe a real bat survey, and see what we end up with. Okay. One of the maps shown by, I think, Ms. Cardoza from Avalon had the vegetation mapping from 2002. Now, that's 16 years ago. I think everybody can assume that vegetation in Nantucket has changed a lot since 2002, and that includes open spaces that have habitat. The scale of that mapping is also, I think the smallest thing that they could determine was 2 acres in size. So if there was a habitat that was smaller than 2 acres, it wasn't included in the map or was lumped together with the one that was next to it. So again, on this project of this size, a 2-acre minimum does not really tell you what's on the property, and without going in there and doing that, you have no ideas. And that's about it. Oh, sorry. I think the chairman asked for some better clarity on the application, or somebody asked for better clarity, and I would agree entirely. I mean, this project has been a moving target. We've gone through 6 months of hearings, and we still only have the final project they want to see submitted to you. I think we need to have a hearing where we get a project. Thanks.
I thought that's what we're trying to do, but anyway, would you like to respond to the question specific to natural heritage, the timeline?
Just to confirm, yeah, we are aware that an ENF will be required for this particular project. Relative to the plant questions, we defer to natural heritage and what they've provided based on the review of existing site conditions, photographs that were submitted by LEC, by Mark Mello, that they've concluded that habitat for rare plants it doesn't exist on site, and they provided the determination letter relative to one rare moth.
If I may, again, for the record, Peter Freeman, attorney for the applicant. You know, no disrespect to the previous speaker, but it's another example of the redundancy in not getting to the point. On one point, he said, which I believe is inaccurate, that we need to see details on what the real project is. That's why I said a few minutes ago we'd like to present our further, more detailed plans. The more important point on the natural heritage issue is we went over it last time, and your town attorney agreed with our position that this is a state issue. We know we have things that we have to comply with, but the question was asked at least 2 or 3 times previously, so now a second or third or fourth time. Can the ZBA defer its action, force us to go through this? That's not the way it works. I'm involved with dozens of projects, hundreds over the years, and yes, we have to comply with the state, but we provide information. We started the process at the state level earlier than we had to, so we could develop information and give you responsible answers, which Mr. Madden has done repeatedly, and to keep having it appear and reappear and hashed over as if it's a local issue. We don't mind sharing the information. We know folks are concerned and the board wants to know about it. But beyond that, sincerely and respectfully, there's no need and not even any really reason to keep going over it at the hearings. We have other important things to do. We're following the state law. We know we have to. That information is public. We've shared the responses, et cetera, and that's what we're going to do. Beyond that, again, with the interest of time, where we keep trying to move things forward, that's the only reason I'm saying this at this point. So we would like to get on to our presentation, and that's where we're at. Thank you.
Thank you.
One more comment.
One more.
On his comments, okay? Again, Bruce Perry on South Shore Road. I was going to bring this up, but my father used to say that he built his houses to state minimums and didn't go past that. I think in a project of this scope and size and affecting the environment of this island, that the board has this jurisdiction that it can require more than the state minimum to protect the property and the environment on this island from this project. And yeah, just go past the state minimums would be a start. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to speak?
Can I?
Sure.
Sure, Megan Perry. We have heard the plan that they have submitted to Mass Housing. We have heard the plan they've submitted to Mass Housing. There hasn't been another plan submitted to Mass Housing. So I think it's okay for us to be asking questions at this point. That's all.
Thank you. How does the board feel about the natural heritage issue?
Can we just get some clarification? Does this fall within our review? I think the
Sorry. I'd love to. Is that okay? Sure. In the packet you guys received this time, I think you'll. I'm sorry.
I thought we were going to answer Jim's question, then we'll get back to you. Yeah, go ahead, George.
You pushed Paul. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, Paul's different than you. I'm not going to push you.
Let's not get into the pushing. Go ahead.
I forget the thought of Paul threw me off, but no, the question for your jurisdiction, yeah, again, there's a fine line. You can address environmental issues of local concern, and you can either deny the permit based on a issue of local concern that you feel outweighs the regional need for housing under that tough burden that you would have to prevail on that issue. Right. Or you could condition things on areas of issues of local concern, including environmental issues, and then the developer would have to prove that if they didn't like that condition, that they would have to prove that it renders the project uneconomic. But I should caution on a couple of issues would be, again, as I said earlier, there's a fine line between an environmental issue of local concern that you're addressing within your purview versus trying to enforce specific regulations and requirements that are within the jurisdiction of the state. So if there's a more restrictive local regulation that applies, apply it. Sit in the shoes of whatever local board would be there. But you don't get to sit in the shoes of natural heritage or MIPA review through the state. You don't get to sit in those shoes. One other thing, Ilana had opined on this for you early in the process because the request had been made before by another attorney to defer your process until this state process proceeded. And she recommended against that there's case law that does not allow you to delay your action, your hearings on the 40B application pending a state process that's underway. You would have to go forward on the issues within your jurisdiction. Any state requirements they would have to obtain under their authority to seek those. So I think that's specific to your question. Something related to it would be, keep in mind that there are also appeal procedures with respect to natural heritage determinations, with parties of standing to pursue those. There's also an administrative appeal process from MIPA, from Mass Environmental Protection Act. When they file their ENF, there'll be requirements on that. There'll be a scoping decision that gets rendered, a certificate. Parties are free to comment on those during that administrative process before MIPA, when they make that MIPA filing, because they've met the thresholds to require that. There are also appeal procedures with respect to MIPA certificates that are a whole different process. So when I talk to you about jurisdictional issues, I do not by any means mean to say that, you know, there aren't separate administrative appeal procedures with regard to natural heritage or MIPA. Those exist, and they're questions for another day, perhaps of the select board or any other party that wants to pursue some type of administrative appeal process in that. But our opinion remains, as Eilander had originally said, that you can't defer your required 40B process pending a state review process.
So just to follow up, so if we look at this as a local environmental concern, there would have to be a bylaw or something that would be more restrictive or that would address this specific issue, or?
Yeah, there really does. If
we
you
can't
would
just
have to find
arbitrarily-
authority to regulate it.
Okay.
If, for instance, say the water quality issue, you're standing in the shoes of the water department. If somebody raises a credible issue to you that this is going to result in contamination of our water well, then you're going to act the way the Water Commission would on that type of issue. But there has to be some type of, you know, regulatory basis for that.
Ideally, there has to be some regular, we could just plain say no, but I don't necessarily think that serves any great purpose.
Megan Perry. As you guys saw in your packet, there is Mass General Law 131. You guys do have the jurisdiction to write a letter to Natural Heritage. That would bring Natural Heritage here to look on the property for the endangered species. I can't recommend enough that you do that. And I'm not a lawyer, but I have spoken to a number of environmental lawyers who agree with that. There's no harm in writing a letter. Would you agree to doing that?
I thought the town had, the selectmen.
No,
wrote a
in
letter.
the way that law reads, it's you guys.
George, you're gonna have to take this one.
It's in your packet. I sent it
saw it.
around.
Yeah, there is a provision for providing notice when a permit, when an application goes before a planning board, zoning board, or conservation commission, and there's an issue of habitat. Within 21 days of that application, that commission or board notifies Natural Heritage of that issue, and they come in. That was an exercise in this case. Obviously, this was before my time when the application was filed. It looks like a moot issue, though, at this point, because Natural Heritage knows about the issue. They've been doing a regulatory review of it, and they've issued a determination. So it's not that they haven't been notified about this habitat issue.
Natural Heritage, correct me if I'm wrong, has been notified about moths, only moths.
No, they
Not about the
specifically
bats.
talked about
Bats?
the blazing star as
Okay.
well.
There are
They
other
also talked
species
about
there.
the bats. If I was reading it correctly, they said they were the ones who opined that you can, or
Not on
said
this
you can only
property.
take the tree down in July or June. No,
Not-
you can't take the tree down in June and July.
Not physically on this property because no one's been allowed on the property to study for the bats.
Just one update as well, because it's surely it's a legitimate issue. If there's habitat issues and you think that there's incomplete information, forget about the zoning board, say anybody from the town. The select board has retained a consultant. They did want to go on the site. It's a legitimate issue of local concern. They want to know what this site is about. They don't want to see a permit go forward with something that, is based on incorrect information. So they've undergone, that process. But again, it's a separate process with Natural Heritage. You're free to, the zoning board's free to write a letter, not within your permitting authority on the 40B, but as, an interested party to send it. The notification issue has already come and gone. If you wanted to present some type of advocacy to the Natural Heritage, that would be a different story. Board of Selectmen, the Select Board has already done that. A couple of other parties have. And I should note also, as I did before, there's an appeal procedure with respect to that. So, parties are free to pursue those issues. In terms of, and just by way of update, because of all these issues about field survey and no ability for the town to go in and do a site visit as the select board's consultant had recommended, I did submit a public records request to Natural Heritage. They're within the time frame for responding to that, seeking any and all documents, including field survey reports that were submitted to Natural Heritage. So when we get that, that response will obviously become public. Either your board or the select board can choose, whether or not they want to follow up further with Natural Heritage based upon the information that was presented, and if they want to pursue some type of an administrative appeal process on that determination. The determination is frankly news to me because I didn't even have a copy of that. I don't know if it went to the town, and I checked with Libby, she doesn't recall receiving it. So,
Can I have that back,
but the
Gary?
town should receive that.
It only went to the applicant unless you requested it and
Yeah.
called and called and called and called and called. and
Okay,
called and called.
don't talk to each other like that, please. Yeah, I mean, it does seem odd that we didn't get this. We got other material yesterday at the last minute. It does seem odd that you wouldn't have given us this. Just saying. It doesn't help. I mean, I can understand the public and probably other board members' concern when we're not given the full picture. I also don't, just leave it there.
Are you referring to the emails from National Heritage?
No, I'm referring to the letter dated October 19th, 2018, Surfside Crossing LLC, CO, I'm in care of Jamie Feely, et cetera, et cetera. Dear applicant, this determination is a final decision of the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife pursuant to blah, blah, blah. I mean, I can read the whole thing, but somehow
I had to request it,
somebody
so-
else got it. I don't quite understand why we weren't given it.
Yeah, I do have a copy of it. It looks like the ZBA was not CC'd on it or the town. Apologies if that didn't make its way over to you earlier.
It does seem odd. Now, having said that,
We did, in our email confirmations that were forwarded yesterday to the board, acknowledge that take determination.
right, I will say, and not in the applicant's defense, because I don't want to go there, but the email stream does talk about every one of these issues and talks about the take. In essence, they've said there was a take on the moths and potentially on the Blazing Star. So I don't know what else needs to be done on that other than it's been determined that there's a take.
May I add, if you read in that letter, there's a 21-day period for appeals. So it's unfortunate that this board did not receive this letter on the 19th as the applicants did.
Amen, but we would, George, correct me if I'm wrong, we would not be party to an appeal of natural heritage, would we?
No, not typically. You would do issues within your jurisdiction. It's certainly an issue for the select board to take up. The select board, with its own money, this isn't the applicant's money that the applicant paid for peer review consultants as part of the 40B process. The select board saw this as an issue of importance, of local concern, of concern to the community, and the select board, at their own expense, retained a consultant that did recommend a field survey. Pursuant to that, like I said, I sent a public records request requesting the field survey information, not knowing that there was a determination as well, but I also sought any and all documents related to that. And as I said, there is a separate administrative appeal process with respect to that can be pursued by the appropriate party. I would recommend that the ZBA stick with, you have enough issues to deal with under your permitting authority with 40B, and it probably makes more sense as something for the select board to consider how they want to respond to that determination in light of the consultant's recommendations that she made.
Yeah, well, no, 21. But what would the normal notice procedure be? You wouldn't, I mean, you wouldn't only notify the applicant normally, would you? In a situation
No,
like,
but
I'm talking about, not you, but the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife.
As I said, the ZBA didn't communicate with them within the initial 21 days. Typically, I would see Concom, where I typically see these would be in a Conservation Commission application, and there's, Natural Heritage knows that there's a wetland permitting issue, whether it be local or state or a combination of local and state. They would typically be copied on any type of letter like this. It happens frequently. I'm surprised at least that the select board wasn't at least copied on it, as they had specifically commented to Natural Heritage as part of this process.
No, I mean, it seems very irregular to me. How else would you know that the determination had been made?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I think a point of clarification. First, as Mr. Pucci said, it often happens related to conservation-related applications, wetlands. We don't have any here. We're not in the jurisdiction. We don't go to Concom. Number two, I believe that Kelly from Avalon in her presentation mentioned that letter. Again, oversight, should have sent a copy, but as Brian said, and you corroborated, it was all explained in the series of emails which you have. So, beyond that I can't explain, but I don't think that it's really an issue in terms of the hearings. You can listen to what George Pucci said, the selectmen or the board, but in terms of our ongoing hearing and trying to move it forward, I still don't see it moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I do think we wouldn't be talking about this if you had given us the letter, and therefore we would have moved forward off of this issue a while ago.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, that's not the point. Your attorney already said that, yes, I was right, it's not a local issue, there's no local bylaw involved. I'm just requesting that you respect the way the laws work, and that the public does also, and you can do any inquiry you want based on what Mr. Pucci just said. That's all I meant by saying we're not moving it forward. We're now probably likely not to be able to present our further, more elaborated plans that were requested last time, and it's really all for naught because it's not within the jurisdiction. So that's all I'm trying to promote.
Well, and I understand that. I understand that. But again, it's a perception issue, if nothing else. And the perception is you were hiding something or just not giving it to us for some odd reason, which doesn't make any sense to anybody in the room.
Why would we be hiding it if you acknowledge that it was summarized?
Perception.
We're human. Mr. Feely erred. There was no intentional withholding it. As you corroborated, all the important details were summarized, and it was mentioned by Avalon that that there's a take.
So I think the perception issue is because you came forth with the position that this was, you wanted to work with the town and this was something to be good for Nantucket and this and that. So to then find out, we're getting plans at 6:30 last night via email. We don't get the determination letter. That persona or whatever perception that you put forth at the beginning, that doesn't ring true when these kinds of things happen. So that's why, for me personally, that's why it seems a little odd and suspect.
Can I just respond to that for a second?
Sure.
So, as far as the perspective of this is concerned, I can just look all of you guys in the eyes and say that I had no idea that this letter hadn't been submitted. It's not something that was ever discussed amongst our team. It was not something that we were trying to hide from anybody. As far as I know, there's nothing in that would, indicate, that we would want to hide or would hide. I mean, it's just so, that's all I just want to say
Thank
on
you.
the issue.
I just wanted to clarify that I received it like 6:30 last night from Eleanor. So I didn't get this letter. All I got was some emails with a summary of it, and I thought it was useful information for you since we were having a discussion about rare species. And I can't comment on their choice of not giving it to you, but I would remind you that we weren't allowed access to the site during the growing season when we could have determined whether the plants were actually there.
Thank you.
Two quick things. I think this goes to show that maybe you should write a letter to Natural Heritage so you can be included in the future, one. And two, if we don't want a bad perception from these developers, let the environmental consultants on the property. The perception you're giving is that you're hiding something.
Thank you.
Patrick Tafe, just a clarification. Is the board, with the comprehensive permit, you're acting as all of our boards and commissioners, are you acting as the Conservation Commission?
I don't.
Because if you are, species, endangered species would come under their jurisdiction.
George?
And I don't know why you wouldn't.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but that one is not an issue because there isn't a conservation jurisdictional issue involved. I did check with the I think I covered this last time or a prior hearing as well, that I did speak specifically to the Natural Resources Coordinator about it because I was frankly surprised with all the wetlands work I do for Nantucket that there wasn't a isolated wetland or a buffer zone or something out there with your more restrictive bylaw. And he confirmed to me that there was no wetland jurisdictional issue, either a state issue or under the local bylaw. So that's a non-issue.
Thank you.
So then if we know that there are endangered species.
And I should clarify on that. If there were an issue, he's correct. You would then be acting under at least the bylaw as the commission. Typically, it would go before them for a hearing, and then they would issue something to you as part of that process. But there is no jurisdictional issue involving Concom.
So moths and plants are not.
No, those are.
May I, because you haven't gotten to read the letter yet, they do bring up Myacomet Pond as a wetland area. It's in the determination letter that you haven't been able to read yet.
Wonderful. Well, anyway, we're going to have to read this and look at it and digest it, and we'll why don't we just table this particular issue for a moment until the next meeting, because there seems to be some question, and we just received the letter, and we'll revisit this. Is that okay with everybody up here, or do we want to keep going with it? I'm good with it. So, fine. Did you have one more thing to say?
Do you want to hear a response to the mention of Myacomet Pond or not?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. The reference there was one individual of another state-listed rare moth encountered during the survey effort. That particular moth is more associated with wetlands, so was not determined to be, the site was determined not to be habitat for that particular species.
Thank you. Again, we just got it. Let's look at it. We'll have to revisit this. The jurisdictional issue is out there, but we'll come back to it. So, having said that, why don't we see what you have in store for us? We have time? Yeah, we can at least see it and then formulate questions.
Before they present, has this been submitted to Mass Housing?
What?
Has this been submitted to Mass Housing? This plan, this new plan they're showing us.
I got it. I got it when she asked me.
We don't
Thank you.
One does not submit all interim plans and the back and forth that is typical in a good part of 40B. You don't do it. You do it as part of final approval at the end, assuming, that there's a permit to go forward with. Thank you.
So we're still working off the 156 unit plan as what they have submitted to the state, correct?
Again, my perception of the process is different than yours. My perception of the process is they've submitted a modification that we're looking at. I mean, you're acknowledging at this point that that's what we're talking about, the modification.
Correct.
And that has been my experience when I've sat on other 40Bs. Ultimately, everything will be submitted when there is a final plan. There's no final plan. Well, how can they put in a final plan until we answer until we continue these discussions until we get to a final plan? But I think then it would be submitted. And again, we're going to elicit the help and aid of the public in terms of the water issues, delivery, sewer treatment, cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but we're not there yet. Go ahead.
All right. Good evening. Jamie Feely, the applicant. We've been busy further developing the proposed modifications while also working with the various professionals, consultants, and department heads on a range of issues, and are happy to be back in front of you reporting on the progress and presenting further development to these plans. Don Bracken, our civil engineer, is here today and will lead off the PowerPoint presentation. He's going to present the detailed site plan and subdivision plan, including sewer and drainage for the proposed modifications. On the subject of sewer, Don and I had a productive meeting with David Gray, the head of the sewer department, and Dan Sheehan, the ZBA and town's consultant from Weston and Sampson, this past Thursday. What is clear on that front is that we can install a pump station on our property and run a force main to the plant. However, also addressed in that meeting was Dan and David's preference for us to contribute the funds we would otherwise spend toward an effort to get a gravity system installed if viable. We discussed some potential approaches to that end, which David was going to further vet with the town manager and others, and which we welcome further discussion on within the context that it does not add cost or time to the project. Don and I also met with Chief Murphy, who offered some clear feedback, all of which has been implemented into the proposed modified plans in front of you now. Our traffic consultant, Bob Michaud from MDM, is not here today since traffic is not part of the agenda, but he did participate in a teleconference this past Thursday, which included the town's traffic planner, the town's consultant Beta Group, and the ZBA's consultant Tetra Tech. The purpose of this teleconference was to determine areas of differences in the analysis and findings amongst the professionals, as well as to identify mutually agreed to findings of the project's impact. I understand there was a mutual agreement on the proportional project impact, which is limited to 2 locations. The details of this call have been summarized in memos from MDM and Tetra Tech, which were submitted to the ZBA. Chris Dalmas, our architectural firm, from our architectural firm Design Associates, is also here today and will be presenting the further development made to the architectural elements of the proposed modification plan. One of the cottages, the one the HDC was most concerned with, has been swapped out for a new design, and Chris and his team have spent significant time in an effort to be responsive to the concerns articulated by this board relating to the condominium buildings. After they considered several concepts, we think Chris and his team have come up with a successful approach to creating variation while also maintaining continuity. We'll look forward to your responses to these changes. Lastly, we have spent a substantial amount of time working with various attorneys, housing specialists, and lenders on the condo restriction piece. This is a highly regulated piece of the puzzle, which we need to get right. We feel good about the level of vetting we have achieved to date from both a legal and lending standpoints, but need to finalize our proposal with the input of a local housing focus group we've been working with before making any final language public. However, we do feel good that the direction of the restrictions can be and will allow us to restrict all 60 of the condo units to year-round Nantucket residents. In closing, we're glad to see good progress being made on the various fronts of this application and thank the board for its continued diligence. We appreciate that there's still a lot of items to cover, but we are encouraged to see many of the issues well on their way to being concluded. We will continue to look to the board for feedback on what is now before you and areas you feel need further attention. And we look forward to concluding the ones that are currently still in front of us. I'd like to hand the presentation over to Don Bracken.
But we make that part of the record, your letter, we didn't get that, did we?
This has my personal notes on it, but I can send you a
Please do.
electronic version.
Okay. Yeah. I'm willing to stay, but I know that some want to catch the boat. Yeah. I know. I want to catch touch the boat too. But what I was gonna suggest is if the board just determines that they wanna go forward without George here for some brief moment, we will. But yeah, 7:45 was the idea. Because the last boat's at 8:20, correct?
8:15.
What? Well, you're gonna have to take the boat. I don't know what to say, or leave, I don't, it's up to you. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to go as quickly as I can through these slides. Oh, you got it? Okay. The board asked us to look, determine if there's going to be separate phases for the project. So these first few slides show the phases. Some of them are common sense. First phase would obviously be, clearing the site, paving the base course, putting in all the utilities, drainage, so forth, and sewer. The next phase, as far as construction of the buildings, would be the condominiums and the recreation building and pool area and the maintenance barn. Third phase is broken up into two parts with the single-family cottages. There's part two. The interior of the roads would be done second. The exterior lots would be done first. This is the subdivision plan that we submitted, typical for other 40B subdivision plans that have been done recently. If you recall, the condominium lot was up front. We're going to have to do an approval not required plan for that. Now the condominium lot, 3.5 acres in the rear, as you know, can be included as part of the subdivision, so it can all be included on one plan. We added some zoning information and description of the disposition of the lots. Highlighted in red are the affordable lots, the 10 affordable lots spread out throughout the project. This is focusing in on a larger scale for the site plan. As Jamie had mentioned, we did meet with Chief Murphy. We've made some changes to the plan from that last plan that we discussed, primarily to get access in between the buildings, locating the handicap spaces where Chief Murphy wanted them, and to be able to get to the corners of the building. This defines, obviously, in more detail the parking, the islands, in dimensions and so forth from the previous plan that we had seen. Again, same thing in detail. As you can see, we're showing the proposed houses on each lot. You can see in more detail the island that was on the other plan, 2 islands actually in the on-street parking, the intended houses that are on each lot. If you look closely at the plans, the houses that have an A after them, like BA or AA, those are the affordable lots. As we talked about at the last meeting, 40-foot road width, very less waivers than were required in the past. Next one, please. Again, just another detail of the southern section of the property. Same thing, parking on the road with the islands in more detail. This is the overall plan. This is where we can talk about some of the drainage. Everything is shown on one sheet, including the houses, roadways, and utilities, and so forth. As we mentioned earlier, we're adding some LID drainage systems to this property around the condominium area. This narrow area in the buffer zone is going to be a rain garden, or also known as a bioretention area. There's also one in the back, and there's one along this side. Drainage from the parking areas will flow directly into these areas, be treated, and then go into subsurface leaching areas. All roof runoff will be also added to the subsurface leaching areas. This portion of the site will be catch basins into oil grit separators and then into subsurface leaching systems. We also, if you go back, we added the well locations on the abutting properties. As you can see, this is Wero. There's a well located up in this corner and another well over in this area. The drainage is going to be finalized, showing that this rain garden will be sealed, so there won't be any infiltration from this rain garden, but the infiltration will take place in this area over here, which is outside the zone 2 and meets the minimum setback of 100 feet to the neighbor's well. We also have an infiltration area over here, which is much greater than 100 feet to this area, to this well, and there's another well right here, and we meet that separation requirement there also. The sewer is pretty much what we talked about before. We're going to have a gravity system down into this corner where we're going to have a pump station. It's going to go out into South Shore Road by the bike path all the way to the wastewater treatment plant. Next slide, please. And this is a typical landscape for two of the select lots. Belgian block, driveway apron. You can see typical, vegetation around the borders. Some will have decks and some will have patios. There was a question brought up about sheds last time. We are proposing a 6x8 shed on each lot. That's under 5,500 square feet. Lots that are over 5,500 square feet will have an 8x10 shed. Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that these are the plans that we submitted to you guys last night, and it's because I pulled them out of last week's presentation because there was a couple small issues with them that I wanted corrected, and when I got them back over the weekend, I submitted them on Monday. So I just wanted to put into perspective what it was that was submitted late.
And now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Dalmas and go through the architectural plans.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Chris Dalmas of Design Associates. After the ZBA hearing on October the 3rd, we explored several options to respond to the board's concerns, primarily with respect to the design of the condominium buildings. There are a total of 100 units in the proposed design, broken into two major components of 40 cottages and 60 condos, reduced from the original count of 60 cottages and 96 condos. The distribution of the affordable cottages and the year-round cottages is now shown on the affordable cottage footprints on the site plan shown in gray. The cottages are a mix of 3, 4, and bedroom units, all of which are outlined in this chart with the allocation to the different cottage designs that were presented at the last hearing. The original Type A and Type AA designs have been eliminated. These were designs that the HCC had concerns with. And a revised Type A cottage has been proposed. This cottage design shares many of the same characteristics of the Type B, C, and D cottages, with porches, dormers, and a reduced building height from the 30-foot of the original Type A to 28 feet. There are now a total of 7 dwelling unit types, reduced from the original submission of 8. As requested at the last hearing, we have provided a rendering from South Shore Road illustrating how the 50 to 70-foot buffer greatly limits the visibility of the overall project from the road. Now, obviously, when you drive by the entries, you will certainly be able to see into the project.
Mr. Chairman, you had requested that perspective from South Shore Road, and when we got it, we realized that may or may not be what you were thinking. And if you wanted an aerial from that, perspective looking in at the whole lot, it's something we're going to actually add in addition, but our renderer didn't have time. So we're happy to do that if it's something, if it's more what you had in mind.
Yeah, I think the more the merrier. It's a detail at this point.
Okay, now onto the condo buildings. The condos are a mix of studios, 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units with 23 bedrooms, 22 bedrooms, 12 one-bedrooms, and 8 studios. The breakdown of affordable and year-round condos is also included in this slide, and this remains unchanged from the previous presentation. Of these units, there are a total of 8 accessible units, or 13% of the overall project, including 1 studio, 5 one-bedrooms, 1 2-bedroom, and 1 3-bedroom. Area tabulations for each of the condo buildings for ground cover for the lower level plan, first floor plan, second floor plan are shown on this chart and essentially remain unchanged from the last presentation. For the condo buildings, there is one gambrel, which is the Type A building, and it's all the way over to the left of that rendering, and is centered on the common green. There are 4 other buildings labeled as Types B through E, which flank the north and south sides of the common. Type B and Type D are Dutch tipped, which means there's sort of a clip to the gable, and Type C and E are shown as gabled. These Types B through E represent either modified changes or new designs in response to the comments from this board at the last hearing, which I'll review in more detail shortly. The gambrel condo building is on the center of the common. The gambrel condo building is on the center of the common, and the gable end and Dutch tip designs are on each side. I think it's important to note that the rendering from October the 3rd only showed the condo buildings, defining the common green. This modified rendering from a similar vantage point now shows the condo buildings adjacent to the cottages that are at the south side of the common. What is interesting to point out is that with their gabled end or Dutch tip projections, they tend to, the condo buildings tend to repeat the cottage commonscape, I'm calling it, and blend and integrate with the cottages. We did explore several alternative building styles and found what is proposed best responds to this board's concerns. We listened and have responded with an additional condo building design and modifications to the one presented at the last hearing. I will briefly outline the key features of each of the 3 condo building types now. This is the building A, Type A. It's gambrel, wraparound porches, Nantucket gray trim, black windows, cottage corners, shingle columns, shed dormers, and 6/1 windows. Next slide. Buildings B and Building D. Dutch hip massing at the end gables, and there's a gable end at the center gable. Wraparound porches with cross balusters, platinum gray trim, black windows, no gutters, cottage corners, simple bracketed columns, shed dormers, 2/2 windows, and there's also a 2nd-story deck at the center gable. Next slide. And this is the new condo building design, which responds to your comments from last hearing. Gable massing, white trim, white windows, has board and batten, painted shutters, porches with open baluster railings, gutter and gutter returns at gable ends, typical Nantucket columns with base and cap, lattice panels at porch corners, gable dormers, 6/6 windows, and a 2nd-story deck at the center gable. We are submitting floor plans for the now 3 building types, which graphically portray the breakdown of the studio, 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units on a floor-by-floor basis, with each color coded. These floor plans remain unchanged from the previous hearing presentation. Finally, I just want to touch on the recreation building, which is presently shown only on the site plan and has yet to be designed, with the architecture to be presented at a later date. The recreation building is essentially on the opposite end from the Type A, or the gambrel mass, on the east side of the common. It is anticipated that this building footprint will be approximately 3,500 square feet, with an approximate building height of 28 to 30 feet. The main floor will support the following uses: mailboxes for all residents, a fitness center, sitting area lounge, coffee bar, service kitchen, cathedral entry foyer. The upper level will support the following uses: community multi-purpose meeting room, sales office during the sales period, changing to property management offices at the completion of the sales period. The below-grade lower level will support the following uses: 2 bowling alleys, a game room, mechanical, electrical, and storage. Architecturally, this recreation building may give homage to the early days of the Nantucket Railroad, which served both Sconset and Surfside. Just a quick summary of some of the architectural changes and the site plan changes that were represented at the last hearing and also in this hearing. The multifamily buildings that were sited to the rear and have been positioned to conceal the parking at the rear of these buildings, to break up or spread it around the rear perimeter of the site, always with that 25-foot buffer that wraps around the entire perimeter. The proposed modifications provide a 50 and 70-foot buffer along South Shore Road, increase from the previous 30-foot buffer. The condo buildings have been reduced in ground cover from 5,100 square feet in the original submission to approximately 4,400 square feet, and from a total of 6 condo buildings to 5 condo buildings. Porches were added to break up the facade of the condo buildings, providing shadow and separating the lower portion of the condo buildings from the upper portion of the condo buildings. This concludes the architectural presentation and presentation of Surfside Crossing, so I turn it back to the board. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, pretty much at the end. You guys are finished, right? It's 7:40. You want to leave as well, right, by the 8:20? Yeah, we really have to. Okay, so we don't have to say anything.
45, so probably set a hearing date.
I thought we had one.
I think we have.
Oh, we do it, that's true. We do have, right. We set a date for December then?
Yeah. All right, so looking at December, first of all, what does YP mean?
Yes preferred.
Yes preferred, as opposed to yes, okay.
So the one with the most yes preferred was, I think, the Tuesday, the 18th?
Tuesdays are not good for me.
No.
This is my second, next week will be my second Tuesday.
Yeah, let's skip Tuesday.
Can't do
It's fine.
Tuesday.
How about Wednesday the 5th? Everybody was a yes preferred, and a maybe. One.
That's the week after the 27th.
So what? I mean, at this point,
Yeah, that's fine with us.
try to accelerate getting
Fifth,
some.
fifth works.
Or does everybody else feel that that's too early after the 7th?
No, we haven't
No, the
even had it.
fifth is fine.
27th, I mean?
They can work with the.
Okay?
So,
So we're good on the 5th?
December 5th.
Are we're gonna do it here again?
Do you think we have to continue to do it here? It would give more flexibility on the.
Oh, you mean people will be here?
Can we double up with December Delight? Yeah, I think they're more, it's still too many people. So, check. All right, so 12/5/2018 here at 4:30. These dates were available, right?
yes, I double checked today.
So
Thank you.
so we have November 27th and December 5th?
Yeah.
Yeah. 5th. Please.
No, well, the next hearing is the 27th.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, having said that,
December 5th or Wednesday?
did we make, yeah.
Yes.
Is that okay?
That works.
Okay, so can I get a motion to that effect? So moved. Karen made the motion. Who wants to second it?
Second.
Jim seconds it. Any further discussion? Oh, God. Can we just finish the vote? Does this pertain only to the meeting date? Thank you. So we're voting on the meeting date. 12/5. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Go ahead, Ron, quickly.
Just quickly, when are you gonna get to the sewer treatment plant? A Dave sewer treatment plant can handle another 1,200 houses.
Well, we're going to try to get to it. We're
Because the entire dump is contaminated now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again. Yes, I was going to get to the agenda, but would you like to do it? That's what I was going to get to. Thank you, though. All right. Well, yeah, I feel the help. Traffic. We had to deal with the traffic still. Hopefully, there's been a meeting of the minds, at least in terms of the presentation. We'll get to that, and then
If that's the end of the consultants, we will begin to get into detail on many of the other issues: sewer, water delivery, MESA, natural heritage, traffic, water quality, et cetera, all the things we've talked about preliminarily. And waivers, waivers. I had that on my notes, ever hopeful. Didn't work. So anyway, can we get a motion to adjourn? Is there anybody else who wants to say anything? No, good.
I'll make the motion.
Karen makes a motion to
Second.
adjourn. Jim seconds. Any further discussion? No. All those in favor say aye. Aye.